amidst some of the thanks I've earned today, I've also earned a well-deserved brickbat. I omitted to include Robert's bio in your program, so apologies, Robert, but I'm going to rectify that now by reading you very quickly his bio from the book. It's all right, Robert. Robert has a BA in Islamic History from SOAS and a DPhil from Oxford in Indian anthropology. He was consultant in Indian and Islamic arts as arms at Sotheby's London in the 1980s, and has also been a consultant for the Al-Sabah collection in Kuwait. He is a fellow of the RAS and the Society of Antiquaries, and the author of, amongst other things, Arms and Armour at the Jaipur Court, which is how I first met him. So Robert's our first speaker for today, and then we will carry on to our other presentations.
I'm going to move the pictures. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. I am here because Giles and Marin charmed me into coming, and I wish to express my thanks to them for doing that. They were all naturally lazy, and possessed with a bit of encouragement. So, why is this an important collection? Because it is an important collection. The answer is that it has a very wide variety of things in it, nothing's happening. Thank you very much. The collection is also important because it helps to be able to separate what is Muslim and what is Hindu, which is obviously a major step forward in deciding what an object is and where it comes from. And in the final analysis, it is crucially important, and I mean crucially important in arms and armour terms, for helping us to get dates on objects, which is always a contentious matter. And one sees on anything that gives you a date or enables you to date something accurately. So, inevitably, arms and armour people go straight back in India to the Architectonics, and what I would say about this picture, and I suggest that it contains things that are Hindu and Muslim. It gives us a date, 1589, thereabouts, where we can see that the majority of objects, appear to be versions of blades of this shape. Okay. And you have a wasted blade here, which I suggest is in fact a Hindu form. That no doubt they're interchangeable because people pick things up on the battlefield or wherever and they use them. But that is our starting point from what we see, and you can see the different types of ponds on those daggers. Basically, they have sort of little wings, most of them, at various forms, and the various forms are what are going to hopefully tell us something about what might be Hindu and what might be Muslim. The other thing to bear in mind is you have the straight handle or the bulbous handle. What else to tell you about? And they've taken katars, the basic katar, which is a Hindu object, obviously, and they have turned them into something that is vaguely Muslim, which is possibly more to do with the man who did the drawing than reality. So we go to the most famous group of daggers from the Jaipur Court, and here we have an interesting thing. We have a pommel, this sort of roof-shaped pommel. There are examples of these. There's one being worn by Maharaja Khan in a painting done in 1610. Maharaja Khan, of course, was famous for his close relations with the Rajputs, and this is thought to date from 1619, I think is probably a good date. So we have something that's in existence before the road was taken on. It doesn't appear in the Aini Akbari, so presumably it's first made after that date, otherwise we'd expect to see an illustration. So that gives us a start on this. These are highly sophisticated. There's another one in Kuwait, which has the actual scabbard. This one, the scabbard is a later, that's Jaipur work from the 19th century probably. This particular one is in the Wallace collection. Richard Wallace was collecting in the 1870s mainly for the Oriental Gallery, and so that's probably the date when he acquired it. And he was buying for a smoking room, not as a scholar in that sense. He was a great scholar in terms of French furniture and paintings, but in the terms of arms and armour, he didn't know what he was up to at all, and he was probably buying it by the case full. And he got lucky with this piece. So, Mughal or Hindu? Well, you have an interesting point about the grip, the ballistic grip. There's quite a lot being written about that in architectural terms when it comes into use in Mughal architecture. I think we've all probably written the articles and how they fit into the scheme of things. But if that is taken from architecture, it suggests that it is a weapon made in the Mughal court, as opposed to a Hindu piece. When Bhamar doorstepped the emperor and persuaded him to marry his daughter, there was a relationship developed that was for mutual benefit. They both wanted military advantage from it. And it's clearly going to take a bit of time for that relationship to flourish into a friendship that it clearly quite quickly became. So you have the need to wear an item that reflects the relationship, particularly when you get to Jahangir's mother, after all, was some she's likely to have encouraged her children to wear objects that reflected that heritage. There's some jolly interesting articles written by Flood, Cohen, and so on, and they talk about the importance of costume. Costume in the sense of political gesture. There is a language of symbols which you have in across it. Everybody can read it. Can read it. And the symbols of what you wore, how you dress, very important. There's the article by Steve Cohen talks about tie-dye Rajput costume, the textiles, and he's looked at the extent to which they're worn in the paintings, in Mughal paintings, in Dublin, in the sorry. And there's a lot of built-up stuff about how significant it is what you're wearing. I think it is significant, but I think you can take this a bit too far. There is the possibility that the emperor was dressing to appeal to various groups in the court who made up factions. The Islamic faction one, the Jaipur faction clearly another, Persian faction, etc., etc. So when he puts on a dagger, for example, that is Hindu, or whether he puts on a dagger that's Muslim, can reflect what he's thinking about in terms of the relationship with the client groups in court. And I think you can take this the same with costume, and a lot of people look at this as costume now. I think you can take this another way. You can say that this whole structure is a little over-egged, and I think it is possible that Jodhabai liked to choose the clothes that her son wore. The fact that he was emperor was rather here nor there. She actually liked dressing up her son in clothes that came from her own home environment. So you have that possibility, but you equally have the possibility the emperor is being highly political in his choice of clothes. And I would say that it varied. I can't prove it one or the other, neither can anybody else, but I suspect it's a varied thing. Anyway, here we have a dagger that is quite clearly hugely sophisticated in its craftsmanship, and it clearly is something that's made in the Mughal court. But it is, in fact, something that I think is Hindu. There's the reason why. The dagger on the left has confronting peacocks. The little bud or flower in the middle top of the where the button would be is damaged, unfortunately. You often get them with elephants on, endorsed elephants lustrating naturally. And I would say that here we have again the baluster thing, and there are other examples of this. You also have the horsehead knuckleberg, which you get in the Aniakri. So that's a common feature. The dagger on the right would be either, you could have it as Hindu or Muslim, as Rajput or Muslim, I think, or Mughal. So it takes you so far. But the group on the left is a small group, and I think sum up the issue about joining two cultures. I've never seen one with the door stands on the top, but the sloping roof pommel is clearly designed to take that. Which does suggest that it might be Hindu, because it's the most awkward shape to use. If you have one of those in your hand, you can use it to stab downwards. It still juts into your wrist slightly, those long ears on the top. But you can't use it with a point uppermost. It just doesn't work. It's a clumsy thing. And in the language of symbols that I mentioned, I would suggest that it is designed to take the symbols, and as the symbols are Hindu, I think that is a Hindu detail. And at some stage, the Mughals have copied it to make something interesting in the early 17th century. The other influence coming in, and these are three daggers from the collection. The one on the right is the one that concerns me. It's a very, very rare piece. There's another one in the Moscow Armory. The blade is particularly unusual because instead of a ridge running down the middle, it has a recessor. The steel is cut away. The point about it is that it's almost certainly made of made in the Deccan, and it would have come probably when I think I've got it written up actually over there. Can't read it at a funny angle. It's when Soni revolted against his father, he established a rival court at Allahabad, and he commissioned the Vogbveshish manuscript in 1602, illustrates lunette hilts of this form. The famous source of Indian rock crystal is, of course, Golconda, where the hilt was probably made. Blade and hilt are based on a Persian design, so into this mix of Hindu and Muslim, Hindu and Mughal, we have a strong Persian addition. And you can see them. There's a similar dagger on a tray. As they're rather small, they're offered to emperors on those black trays you see people in courtroom. And the one that is in the Kremlin Armory was a gift to Tsar Mikhail Romanov in 1617 from Shah Abbas. There's also a miniature that shows Prince Karam returning from the Deccan, offering gifts to the Emperor Jahangir, which includes a very similar dagger on a tray. The event took place in 1617 with the paintings from 1640. One of the problems I found when I was working in Jaipur was there weren't a lot of swords in the sort of 17th century fighting sense. If you go to Marwar, where I sort of started and where really is sort of my home in India, you get lots of heavy swords of this kind. This is a very splendid one owned by a man called Padam Singh. Padam Singh, great hero. He was the brother of the Emperor, the Maharaja, Padam Singh, and he died in battle. Look at the weight, look at the whole style. One thinks of Mughal stuff as very sophisticated and sort of highly finished and everything else. This isn't highly finished. This is extremely effective. You want to chop somebody in half. But it's not the sort of thing that you can think of in terms of sort of traditional Mughal art. I don't see them in Jaipur. Well, Marwar, where I cut my teeth, is they are the great warriors of Rajasthan. I think there might be others who compete with that, but they are among the toughest. And Marwar, the Thar Desert, is famous for its harshness. And they used to say about Jaipur that Jaipuri swords cut like grass. They're quite rude about the Jaipuris, actually. They think themselves a cut above them, quite literally. What I can say is that they're not there, but also our understanding of what constitutes the Mughal sword, which you will find in plenty of museums and things. You see nice dated Persian steel blades and all the rest, but they bear absolutely no relation to what I think the Rajputs were using. And I think that however integrated they are, the Rajput, thank you, the Rajput tradition maintains itself. You can have something ceremonial in court, but it doesn't wash. I'm going to have to go rather faster, I understand. These are very splendid, ivory-hilted carved things. By the time you get to the 17th century and Aurangzeb's invasion of the Deccan, you've got the two communities are pretty well intermingled, and in many respects, I think their weapons are interchangeable, except, as I say, for the hard-fighting weapons of the Rajputs. These seem to me to be showing quite a lot of influence of Maharashtra. The very curved nature of them seems to me to be a strong element of Maharashtra. But you get lots of these in the Rajput courts, but Jaipur has the most, which is persuasive, I think. You then get to a romantic phase, and the shield has to stand in for this phase. It tells the story of a ruler who is a great hunter and shuts up the ladies of the well, and it seems to symbolize a new romance that, in a sense, Tom plugs into. Then we get to a commercial phase where the tourists are arriving, last numbers in Rajasthan, and they are encouraged to buy absolutely everything in sight that they can, and pretty indiscriminate, and that's the stuff that comes home. A lot of it's extremely bad quality, but there are Victorian accounts of people who are taken into courtyards where they find people making old weapons. Kipling describes making antique weapons, people making antique weapons. There's no embarrassment about it at all. And in fact, they also took early weapons, 1600s this one, perhaps a little earlier, and that's Jaipuri Damascene on it, been done to make it more attractive and so on. You then get to the arrival of a man called Henley, who works as a surgeon between 1874 and 97, and he was very interested in metalworking techniques and crafts and what have you, and he produced a couple of important books and an exhibition with the Maharaja, and this is a sort of rather Victorian version. I suspect that it's not quite accurate copy, but the copy is they put. And the piece on the left reminds me of Linton tiles, which were of course being imported into India at the time. The important thing about Jaipur is that his work gives you a reference, because you know what he bought, and there are these colonial pictures, and the dagger on the left was bought at Christie's in, I think, 97, and the gold work is exactly the same as the sword on the left-hand side, which we know is in fact one that Surgeon Henley bought for the museum, the new museum, Albert Hall. So he probably bought it in the late 70s. And the piece on the left is one of many. That was exhibited at the British Museum. It was then exhibited elsewhere. It's been around the world several times. And there are a lot of pieces like that which have been bought and have been given, in my view, an entirely spurious state. And so Jaipur is terribly important because of these felts which you can. What should the gold work look like? Well, I produced that for the museum. It's a wonderful object. It gives you an idea of the richness of the collection. Turban helmet and made to look like folds of cloth. The two lots of gold work, copper work at different dates. It has its problems. There's no problems at all for it. There are a number of these that were covered from the Deccan in the period of sort of late 17th, early 18th century, late 17th. And nobody has written about it, but it shows you the sort of gold work. And I did talk to, what's his name? Textile experts. Rahul, thank you. I did talk to Rahul about it, and he thought that the pattern was too finicky to be 17th century. He thought it was 18th, an 18th century, early 18th century copy. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that the decoration is genuine as opposed to the very late stuff that you see. A lot of pieces which have been given, by view, entirely spurious dates, which of course now found right through the museum world and are distorting the whole game. Here, let me give you these two examples of sort of thing. So on the left, typical Jaipuri work, and it has bright steel background. The gold looks wonderful against it. It has a 19th century blade with a fake signature relating to the 16th century Persian maker, Asadul Isfahani. The one on the right, rather more of a problem. It looks rather nice. It's a 17th century hilt. I'm sure it is. Has it been redecorated? Yes, I think it probably has actually, but the quality is good. And of course, they had very high quality, particularly the work that had been done in the Maharaja's personal atelier. The real rubbish comes from the Punjab, and the Punjabis came to Jaipur and taught them how to make shields with the cheapest possible systems to use as little gold as possible, sold in great numbers to tourists. But they produced so many of those blood, to get them. But they are mass-produced, and you see them great quantities, very common pattern. When the Maharaja wanted something, he could actually make something really good. And these things turned out top quality. But in Rajasthan, you normally had a hilt that matched particularly what Maharaja's. The Maharaja would design a hilt for his reign so that his supporters could actually have something that demonstrated their allegiance, just as he would design a park for himself, which everybody was expected to wear when they came to court, that sort of thing, shoes as well, apparently. And so you have here two swords which ought to have been made at different ends of Rajasthan that aren't, both clearly made from the same workshop, and there are other pieces. There are also pieces in the Royal Collection which Edward VII, as he was going to be picked up in 1875 when he went to Jaipur and shot a tiger. And here we have, let's say, good quality work, but unquestionably late, although I don't say that it would be catalogued that way. He was given a present, and all the rulers given presents, so not in trouble. They're all in Buckingham Palace where they're not on display, although there was an exhibition very recently. Good quality work, excellent quality work, was obtainable in Jaipur in 1875. That piece is a complete mystery. There isn't one like it. It's a fancy piece. I'm sure that it's Jaipur work, and the only question is why was it done? Possibly it was commissioned by by Maharaja or a Thakur or someone, and it would have likely ended up with the World's Collection in the late 70s. We end with this monstrous thing, which I can't explain. Why it was ever created, I do not know. I thought you'd probably like his title, which is an absolutely wonderful title, and that concludes my talk.
Thank you. Sure. Incidentally, you may have noticed that I'm not Dr. Norbert Peabody. He was another casualty of the racetracks, I'm afraid. So our next paper is Renate Dohmen, who will talk to us about, this is not the Maharaja of Jaipur, she says, photography in the manner of Sawai II.
Yeah.
Revealed, I guess.
Just getting the camera ready.
It's just so that you can be seen online
Oh, I see.
and the slides.
They can be in, it's okay.
Okay, I think we can probably get started. Okay.
Well, I hope everybody can hear me from here, so thank you all for put your hands up if you need to speak up. But again, also for me, first of all, many thanks to the organizers, Alison, Ring, Giles, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be here and learn more about that school. Never knew anything about stores, I have to say. It might come in handy. So, what I'd like to do here today is explore this particular subject. Next slide, please. You have it a bit bigger. And I hope to convince you that it's absolutely extraordinary and in a move that I'd like to think is worthy of Ram Singh and reflects what I argue is his mold-breaking modus operandi when it comes as a photographer. And I'd like to situate his photographs somewhat provocatively, perhaps, in relation to the experiments by the avant-garde artists in Paris at the time, who were busy ripping up the rules of image making, that is, as art as taught at the French Academy. Artists who are now famous, such as Edouard Manet, Claude Monet, or Cézanne, just to name a few, were experimenting with how to reinvent the visual arts in ways that responded to their view and experience of contemporary life. In a related move, I'd like to argue that Ram Singh presents us here with a deliberate departure from the representational norms of how Indian princes were to be photographed at the time, which I argue is on a par with avant-garde subversions of avant-garde art in Paris. In order to prove my point, I will present the pictorial, which I hope I prove, I will present the pictorial conventions photographers of Indian princes were expected to employ and then delineate how he departed from them in ways that cannot be considered, but not be considered accidental, but only needs to be acknowledged as deliberate and intentional. In order to do so, a setting of the scene is also required to provide the necessary background information more generally, and given that I only have 20 minutes, all of this will have to be quite brief and to the point. So, I think next image. We've seen this already, so I don't have to say much about it. As we've already seen, quite a number of images in the collection of Jaipur Palace reflect the encounter with European ways of image making, and this is an example here. And we've already talked a lot about the Mughal influences, but also the European influences and how kind of European influences kind of come from two directions. To Jaipur or to India in general. And maybe just as a reference, which you all know, of course, that at the sort of time when the Mughal emperor, and I can have the next slide, for example, a very famous miniature here, he of course used some European pictorial conventions or image pictorial elements, such as the halo, for example, which will reappear later in this presentation. So just to say, this is quite a long-standing tradition, and there are different avenues and different contexts for this kind of borrowing or inspiration, whichever way you want to call it. So now let me give you some brief context of Ram Singh II's life. He was born in, I think we can have another slide. He was born in 1833. He became the Maharaja of Jaipur at the tender age of 16. 16 months, sorry, a crucial detail, on the death of his father. A Regency Council of local noblemen overseen by British officers ruled the state until his accession to the throne in 1851, and his rule ended on his death in 1880. But when he was first inaugurated, he was but a shadow prince who was under British tutelage and was only nominally in charge of a state that was firmly in the hands of powerful noblemen who were happy to have him as a figurehead, but had no intention of actually handing him real power. But Ram Singh turned out to be an astute politician who emerged as an undisputed ruler of Jaipur, getting the better of both the British and his clansmen by beating them at their own game. So Ramsingh took power by carving out a space between Rajput and British vested interests, acknowledging both, while maneuvering between them as needed to safeguard his interests, at times yielding, at times evading, at times opposing demands. What I want to suggest is that his astute maneuvering between cultural spaces is relevant to the manner in which he approached the making of his photographic self-portraits, which is why I'm mentioning it here. So now let us turn to his photography. He not only took his own photographs, but developed his own prints. He kept abreast of developments in photography through a subscription to the Journal of the Bengal Photographic Society, and he also had a sizable collection of Indian and European images of Indian and European photographic studios. One can therefore safely assume he was familiar with European pictorial conventions, and his landscape and cityscapes photographs certainly display his grasp and understanding of them, as well as his adherence to them. So next slide, please. So that's one of his, here's an image of the Taj. Then there's another one, I think. Yeah, so you can see how, how he framed his images. I thought I had somewhere, maybe this comes later. The largest number of images in his oeuvre, however, were photographs of people in studio settings. He photographed courtiers. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Okay, then this is another kind of comparison. As you can see, the slide on the left is the Maharaja Singh. On the right, the same street, pretty much by the same vistas, and photographed pretty much the same way by Warner Shepherd, one of the most well-known British photographers and photographic studios. And if we have the next slide, we can compare his work to the work of Raja Deen Dayal, the most prominent Indian photographer at the time. So you can see there's not much in terms of difference or particular vista. So now we get to the courtiers. Next slide, please. So he photographed courtiers, he photographed Europeans, next slide please, in studio settings. And notably, next slide, he also took a photograph of the Prince of Wales. And so, yeah, but notably, he presents him, can I have the next slide, as a private individual rather than as an institution, which is maybe a hint of how he himself would like to be seen. But when he accepted and photographed photographed in ways that replicated at European artistic conventions, when it came to photographic images or studio portraits of Indian sitters, I contend that, not surprisingly, perhaps for somebody as astute as Ramsingh, he did for the most part not rehearse the colonial gaze when counting his photographs of Indian sitters. This is evident, for example, in his Nana photographs. Next slide, please, which unfortunately we won't have time to go into. What I want to focus on in the following is his negotiation of the specific pictorial conventions of the British Raj for the depiction of Indian princes, which will provide the necessary context for discussing the self-portrait we're examining here today. Next slide, please. Rajput princes were known to be warriors, and this is how the most prominent Indian photographer at the time, Raja Deen Dayal, presented the Rajput ruler of Orcha. We see him centrally placed in the image frame, sitting on his royal cushion in what appears to be his palace. He has two attendants standing behind him. The prince is not gazing into the camera, but looks firmly and purposefully sideways. He's holding a highly polished Rajput shield upright in front of his body, as well as a sword in a rather suggestively phallic manner, underscoring the assumed virility of the Rajput warrior. Next slide, please. Ramsingh was likely photographed by Tim Murray, a British photographer who, when we think has introduced him to photography, is likewise centrally placed and posed on his royal cushion against a cloth backdrop with a sun motif, which is placed behind his head. It references the sun lineage of his Rajput ancestry, but also gives the impression of a halo. So he therefore cleverly combines European and Rajput visual idioms to maximum effect in ways that hover on the edge of seriousness and subversion, as argued, while also making reference to the Mughal use of halos in portraits of Mughal emperors. He gazes straight into the camera with a quizzical rather than purposeful expression, and likewise has a Rajput shield in front of his body, and a sword is seen lying in front of him on his gadi. Comparing the two images, next slide, the difference between them becomes strikingly evident. As you can see, neither Ram Singh nor his shield or sword are erect and alert as expected of a Rajput warrior. Ram Singh rather slouches, his shield is nearly as flat on the royal cushion as his sword, and his outfit emphasizes his rather slight physique and spindly arms, a clear disavowal of the required stereotype of the Rajput warrior. Moreover, the cloth backdrop is decidedly crumpled, which furthermore undermines the photographic tropes of the splendor and exotic opulence of Oriental princedom. Next slide, please. He does, however, have the Star of India pinned to his chest and also wears the associated sash, making a statement about the honors the British Raj has bestowed on him, thus underscoring the loyalty such honors evidence, perhaps to counterbalance the liberties he has taken with the notably lukewarm presentation as Oriental Prince. Moreover, it would appear this is not a one-off, but could be read as the visual equivalent of his way of engaging with the British Raj, keeping up appearances just enough to get away with as much as possible. Next slide, please. Here's another example. On the left, you see Ravi Verma's painting of the young Maharaja of Baroda at his investiture in 1881. As you can see, the image is based on the conventions of studio photography and most likely was painted on the basis of a photograph. So how does this compare to the photo of Ram Singh? Both images show the typical props of photographic studios at the time: a draped table with a book or books, an upholstered chair, a background curtain, and Ravi Verma's image also has a column. Both men are standing, both are in recognizably Indian outfits, both are shown in three-quarter view, gazing into the distance. So far, so good. The Maharaja of Baroda, however, is standing erect. His one hand clasps a sword, the other rests on a table ornament. His ornate jacket is neatly belted. He has a vacant gaze that does not make direct eye contact with the viewer and thus does not challenge the perusing eye of the viewer. This gives permission, thus giving permission to be the object of the gaze, which in the context of British India, I would argue, presents the Maharaja as a type, the Oriental prince par excellence, who is dished up for visual consumption for the colonial viewer, in a manner similar to how women were presented as objects of the male gaze in 19th century images. As the renowned art historian Linda Nochlin has pointed out in the next slide, with regard to the work of Edward Said, whose watershed publication Orientalism gave rise to post-colonial studies. And here's her quote: "Said's critique of Orientalist representation offered many parallels to the feminist critique of the representation of women." Now let us look, next slide please, at Ram Singh in comparison. On the face of it, we are looking at the same type of image, an Oriental prince standing at a table in a studio setting in his native outfit. There are, however, crucial differences to note. For one, his long coat is not fastened and reveals his clothing underneath, which adds a touch of informality and undercuts the trope of the Oriental prince as perfect exotic spectacle. Let us now examine his pose. As you can see, his right hand is positioned on his hip, which can be read as an assertive stance, and is thus at odds with the designated role of princes during the Raj that defined them as pliable puppets of Oriental spectacles lacking agency. Ram Singh is also leaning on the book and the table as if he needs to prop himself up. This could be seen as a mocking enactment of the stereotype prevalent at the time of the decadent prince who is indulged in alcohol or opium. The Maharaja therefore seems simultaneously assertive with his hand on his hip and weak as to have to prop himself up, thus failing to perform the required spectacle of Indian princely existence, an impression that is further supported by the somewhat wistful gaze that has not wholly evacuated his personhood and does not offer his face as a blank screen for the projections, expectations, and fantasies about romantic princes. This failure to comply with the conventions of the photographic princely portrait also draws attention to the inherent contradiction in performing the image of an authentically, in inverted commas of course, and by implication backwards in feudal Indian princely self in the modern space of the photographic studio, not to mention the contradictory expectation of princes to be reformist and modernizing in their approach to governing their states, despite the traditionalist and costume presentation required at durbars or public-wise regal reception, and as we've seen, in front of the photographic lens. But what about his self-portraits? Here we suggest we enter a different, try the next slide, perhaps the next, yeah, here we go. Here I suggest we enter a different territory where Singh has abandoned the tropes of Oriental spectacle altogether. That is, he moves beyond subverting given conventions, which is an approach I argue, which is what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. I want to put on a par with the artistic avant-garde in Paris, kind of rebelling against the artistic conventions in the educated or they were expected to follow. As you can see, gone are the studio props, the tropes of empire, such as princely attire, references to imperial honors received. We are rather looking at an individual in unbuttoned attire with a mark on his forehead that lets us know he's a devotee of Shiva. He looks straight into the camera and by implication into his own eyes, because it's a self-portrait, with quizzical self-scrutiny, which, however, does not turn us, the viewer, into a voyeur, nor does the gaze allow even a hint of objectification. And even though we are witnessing a private act of self-inquiry, we are not given an inch. We are not offered any sense of a psychological insight. Singh gazes out of the image, yet remains distant and enigmatic. In other words, in control. He's not giving anything away. The image is for him. Is a conversation with himself, not as a Rajput ruler or Oriental prince, but, for lack of a better term, a private individual, with the caveat that European notions of individualism have to be referenced with caution here, of course. But apart from giving nothing away in a psycho-individual sense, Singh seems to offer the question, what is really real? If you look closely and observe the left side of the image, for example, you can make out a blurred assistant who is holding up the white backdrop. The way Singh has positioned himself in the image, moreover, suggests that this inclusion is not accidental and was not intended to be cropped at the printing stage. This view is strengthened by the fact that this is not the only instance in his work where the backdrop is pointedly shown to be a make-believe. Next slide, please. In this group photo, for example, the backdrop is no doubt intended to be shown as just that, a backdrop making a point about the illusionary nature of the illusion it is meant to create. Singh is thus using the backdrop as an ironic theatrical device, which in this instance offers a superb commentary on the supposed permanence and superiority of the British Raj, which is also to do with the backdrop, the nature of what he chose, which I interpret to be a reference, or could be a reference, to Calcutta, the city of palaces, but that's just one way of looking at it. Or look at this self-portrait of Singh, next image, which finds him sitting sideways on a European benchwood cafe house chair that was all the rage at the time. He's dressed in a simple white outfit and is situated in a European library replete with an ornate fireplace, curtained windows with drapery palmettes. Also, it would appear as this is clearly a painted backdrop. And Singh makes sure this point is spelled out. As to the right, we see a crouched assistant in the image, And I suggest that this inclusion is fully intentional, as otherwise, if the image was intended to be cropped in the printing process, the sleeping dog would end up headless. And next slide. And here we see him as a quasi-circus master who has trained his dog to perform on cue, and it would seem the dog has successfully completed a routine, which sees it end up on the chair usurping the place of the master. Note the lush English country house, a country estate backdrop that makes the scene even more absurd through the sheer incongruence of the presence of a skinny man dressed in Indian clothes as guest in a simulated English furnished grand country setting where the roles of master and servant are reversed and ridiculed. Ram Singh can thus be said to take a ludic approach to his self-portraits and to his use of normative European photographic props. As already indicated at the beginning of the presentation, I would like to take this recognition further and suggest that the self-portraits, and especially the one, next slide please, we're focusing on today, could deservedly be considered as on a par with the Parisian avant-garde, a suggestion which raises a plethora of questions about art historical methodology, which I don't want to bore you with here today. But what I would like to do is to invite you to an imaginative speculation how the work would be conceived if considered on a par with the Parisian avant-garde and its challenges to pictorial conventions, a consideration I have suggested in my title. This is not the Maharaja of Jaipur. Next slide, please. Which is a reference to Magritte's famous painting of the text called This Is Not the Pipe. And here I would like to draw attention to the fact that my presentation draws on a distinct body of scholarly work. That is, I have cited authors who have worked on the context of colonialism in relation to photography. I have not referred to the larger field of visual studies that engages with self-portraiture in photography per se or in painting. For example, I have thus not explored questions such as, next slide please, what would it mean, for example, to examine Ram Singh's photography in relation to a self-portrait by Pierre Bonnard? Or suggested to look at his photographic and experimental self-staging in relation to the work of Cindy Sherman, next slide, whose early work on film stills addresses issues of gender and objectification and arguably the synergies with Ram Singh's work. Nor have I claimed, next slide please, Ram Singh as antecedent of Magritte. In closing, I want to cite the eminent scholar of Islamic art and architecture, Oleg Grabar, who wrote the following in 1982, noting that this expectation must be really dry or something. Noting that this expectation was not realized. Those among us in the 50s or 60s, he means 1950s or 60s, who specialized in the art of Asia and Africa were for the most part trained in Western art. We believed, at least in retrospect, that the establishment of Italian art of the Renaissance was a paradigm was merely an accident of educational and academic circumstances, and that other circumstances would have given this privilege to Song or Mughal art. The day would come, some of us thought, when introductions to the history of art would be based on any artistic tradition, and when African sculpture or Persian miniatures would help us understand Bernini or Titian. I would therefore like to leave you with this question or imagination, what it could or would mean for the history of art if the self-portraits of the Maharaja of Jaipur became a point of reference for the Persian avant-garde, for example, and therefore for the history of art as commonly understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renate. I don't know if Matty's going to come down and he's orchestrating things behind the scenes. Our next speaker is Shivani Sud. she will be speaking on, she will be speaking on an architectonics of ornament, painting, architecture and design in 19th century Jaipur. Shivani, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to start by thanking, is my voice audible?
Yes.
Yes.
I want to start by thanking Rin and Giles and the organizers of the seminar for convening this wonderful series of conversations on Jaipur and for inviting me to give a talk. I'm really grateful for the opportunity and I look forward to the discussions that follow. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. In the collections of the Maharaja Sawai Man Singh II Museum is an illustrated manuscript of the Devi Mahatmya series, dated from 1875 to 1900. Also titled Durga Pat, meaning a text about the goddess Durga, the Devi Mahatmya is an important devotional narrative that focuses on the significant role of the goddess in creating and protecting the universe. This manuscript contains 28 folios that each illustrate an episode or aspect of the goddess's life. For example, this painting depicts 3 different avatars of the goddess: Kali, the destroyer of evil forces; Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity; and Saraswati, the goddess of learning and the arts. The 3 goddesses sit on gold ornamented thrones, which are placed upon a floral carpet atop a balcony set in a lush garden. In their hand, they hold their respective implements, be it Saraswati's plowshare, Lakshmi's lotus flower, or Kali's severed head. Several of the folios have been attributed to the Jaipur Court artist Ramchandra, and distinctive features of the Jaipur style of paintings can be seen here. For example, the figure's dark, bold outlines, and the rounded facial forms that lend them a youthful appearance. In addition, the goddesses are adorned with the opulent enamel jewelry that was popular amongst royal and colonial patrons in 19th century Jaipur, a principal center for the production of enamel jewelry. Here, the artist has applied paint in thick impasto to form the pearls and gemstones of the ornaments. While the painting features many of the elements of traditional Jaipur painting, it also deviates from earlier painting practices in several ways. These deviations are especially evident when one compares the 19th century painted series to an earlier 18th century Devi Mahatmya manuscript made during the reign of Maharaja Pratap Singh. For instance, in the past, artists in the Jaipur court favored the side or 3/4 profile in the representation of figures. In addition, the scene takes place against a simplistic, largely monochromatic backdrop, interspersed with various hues of green to indicate a grassy terrain. While there is a slight diminishing of figures in the background and an attempt to indicate cast shadows, the figures remain two-dimensional, rendered within sharp black outlines. The scene unfolds in 2 stacked horizontal registers, suggesting the temporal continuance of the episode depicted. The late 19th century Devi Mahatmya deviates from the earlier one in several ways. The 3 goddesses here are shown in view. In addition, while regional Indian painters traditionally employed brilliant hues of reds, blues, and yellows, along with opaque whites, dense blacks, and shimmering golds, the soft pink and peach colors in this painting suggest the appropriation of Mughal and European color palettes. Further, European naturalistic effects, such as the subtle shading of the figures' faces and the foliage in the background, offers a 3-dimensionality uncommon in earlier Jaipur painting. In addition, earlier paintings stylized Mughal floral patterns characteristic of Indo-Persian carpets are replaced here by naturalistic European floral motifs in shades of peach, pink, violet, and yellow. These painterly shifts are indicative of a broader range of artistic experimentations within an expanding field of visual possibilities in late 19th century Jaipur. The latter half of the 19th century in Jaipur was a period of great artistic transformation and experimentation. The establishment of the Jaipur School of Art in 1866 and the Public Works Department in 1860, for example, led to the introduction of British art pedagogy, architectural drafting, and design in Jaipur. While royal patronage of the Surat Khana, or the Royal Painting Atelier, which had served as the primary locus of painting production in Jaipur, gradually waned over the course of the 19th century, artists looked for employment elsewhere. They worked for the landed elite or thakurs of Jaipur as freelance artists, for the Public Works Department as architectural draftsmen, and even for the School of Art, where they made preparatory designs for commercial objects. On the slide here, we see three different forms of artistic practice cultivated by a single artist: a photographic style portrait of the Thakur Balwant Singh, a large-scale architectural drawing, perhaps made for Jaipur's Public Works Department, and a preparatory illustration of two sword hilts, possibly made at Jaipur School of Art. The works highlight the broad artistic repertoire of Mohanlal Sharma, a fourth-generation Jaipur court painter who diversified his working methods to include new forms of artistic practice, such as architectural drawing and design during his career. Although we lack a great deal of information about the careers and histories of 19th century Jaipur artists, Mohanlal's pictorial archive offers valuable insight into the nature of artistic practice in late 19th century Jaipur, as artists no longer worked solely as court painters, but simultaneously as multi-talented freelance artists, architectural draftsmen, and illustrators. I thus see the shifting aesthetics of the Devi Mahatmya manuscript linked with the development of a new visual milieu in Jaipur, in which artists carried over artistic styles and ornamental forms from one medium to the other as they worked across different social and institutional spaces. A key feature of the Devi Mahatmya manuscript that locates it within the broadening networks of artistic patronage and production of late 19th century Jaipur is the floral carpet on which the three goddesses sit. The carpet appears to be an Axminster carpet, identifiable by its easily recognizable visual program, marked by the naturalistic sprays of roses and other flowers, circumscribed by a thin border with stylized floral motifs. The Axminster carpet was first produced by Thomas Whitty, a cloth weaver from the town of Axminster in England, who had aspired to emulate Turkish carpets after seeing them in London in 1754. An extremely fine and expensive carpet, the Axminster carpet was collected and purchased by royal and elite patrons across Europe, America, and even the royal courts of India. The mass production of the Axminster fueled the popularity of large-scale area carpets as floor coverings for elite and royal homes from the late 18th century onward. Axminster carpets are visually distinctive in their depiction of both stylized and illusionistic floral motifs, geometric patterns, acanthus leaves in a classical style, and gold decorative borders. In this detail from the 19th century Devi Mahatmya manuscript, we see the incorporation of swirling acanthus scroll patterns, an archetypal motif of Axminster carpets, into the design of the carpet above which Brahma, Saraswati, and Vishnu are here seated. This new visual motif reflects shifting aesthetic trends in Jaipur, in which European-style carpets, such as the Axminster carpet, became a popular object in royal and elite homes and spaces of representation in the latter half of the 19th century. Past rulers held court seated on traditional cotton rugs, dharis, or Persian-style carpets. Here we see a representation of Jai Singh II, the founder of Jaipur, seated with Sangram Singh of Mewar on a golden throne above a carpet marked by a decorative pattern of highly stylized floral motifs. 17th century carpets from the Jaipur collection, some of which had been commissioned from the Mughal workshop, are indeed visually distinctive in their use of flat, stylized floral and vegetal forms. A fragment of a mid-17th century carpet from Jaipur depicting such dramatically rendered floral motifs can be seen here on the right. By the 1870s, we see representations of Jaipur's ruler, Ram Singh II, seated upon European-style chairs above a woven accent carpet. In the painting on the left by the artist Mohan Lal, the pink facade recalls the rose-hued walls of the central courtyard in the royal city palace, in particular the Sarvoto Bhadra, a royal audience hall in which the ruler held court. The inclusion of the Axminster carpet within this space suggests that such carpets were likely circulating at the Jaipur court by this time. The representation of Axminster carpets in painted portraits is not, however, limited to representations of Jaipur's Maharaja. Indeed, we see many examples of such carpets in portraits of the Indian elite, such as the ones depicted here. Based on the very pervasive replication and reproduction, similar rugs across 19th century aristocratic portraits from not just Jaipur, but regional kingdoms across India, it is evident that the design of an Axminster had become woven into the very fabric of late 19th century portraiture. For India's Maharajas, nobility, and wealthy elite, European objects like the Axminster carpet came to be seen as symbols of modernity and westernization. In this painting of Thakur Balwant Singh of Khandela by the artist Mohan Lal, the Thakur is seated amongst a dazzling array of luxury commodities that held symbolic and economic value in the 19th century. Above the darbar hangs a large emerald green glass chandelier flanked by a pair of clear crystal ones. Other objects, such as the two wall clocks positioned on the spandrels of the archway, too were upheld by Indian rulers and the elite as emblems of technological modernity. Yet each clock marks a different time. This peculiar detail underscores the role of the clock as a decorative object, an architectural ornamentation, rather than as a practical utility. Certainly, scholars have focused on the conspicuous consumption of India's elite, delving into the history and expansion of luxury commodity trade and production, from jewelry to glass goods, clocks, and European dress. While Balwant Singh's portrait certainly reflects the aristocracy's desire for luxury commodities, the painting is also reflective of a visual program in Jaipur, in which artists worked across different spheres of artistic production, carrying over artistic styles and ornamental forms from one medium to the other. In other words, I suggest that objects depicted in such paintings not only serve as indexical reference for their physical counterpart, also as new stylistic conventions. Here, the artist Mohanlal extends the decorative schema of the Axminster to the edges of the painting, a noteworthy parallel to the custom of weaving Axminster carpets to room size width. The gold border and acanthus scrolls at the edge of the carpet form the border of the painting. The visual motifs of the carpet, architectural ornamentation on the spandrels of the archway both depict the repetition of classical acanthus scrolls. This suggests the circulation and reuse of pictorial fragments and design elements from across genres of art, such as architecture, textiles, and painting. In fact, it is not outside the realm of possibility that Balwant Singh did not own an Axminster carpet, and the visual schema of these popular carpets had simply been abstracted into a standardized decorative pattern by artists in their works. In doing so, Mohanlal would be building upon a compositional strategy previously used by artists at the regional Rajasthani courts and imperial Mughal court, in which the decorative patterns and ornamental details of textiles would be replicated as a decorative floor pattern in paintings. Mohanlal's paintings are not only a representation of the opulent lifestyles of India's aristocratic elite, but also opulent objects in and of themselves. Painted on cloth that spans from 2.5 feet long and 3 feet high, this 1890 painting by Mohanlal would have occupied considerable space on the walls of the home in which it hung, thereby functioning as a decorative ornament, luxury commodity, and architectural feature in its own right. A metonym of the cultural world that India's princes and landed aristocracy inhabited. The painting indeed mirrors the same space in which it hangs. The architectonic space, in fact, reflects the buildings in which the Thakurs resided. The portraits framed within the oval cartouches that decorate the spandrels of the archways and the flowing acanthus scrolls trailing over the marble surface of the arch in Mohanlal's painting can also be seen in the polychromatic painted ornamentation of the exterior facades of late 19th and early 20th century aristocratic homes, an example of which can be seen here in a painted haveli or home located in the region of Shekhawati. The reproduction of architectonic features and ornamental design across architectural and painterly spaces suggests that Jaipur's artists worked within different spheres of artistic production, translating stylistic conventions across media in the process. Indeed, it is formerly employed court painters like Mohanlal that served as the agents of architectural design in late 19th century Jaipur. Amongst the many paintings and drawings by Mohanlal preserved in his family's personal archives, I came across a remarkable detailed rendering of a building facade executed on lightly lined graph paper. While the specific visual program of this building project lies outside of the scope of this talk, the design is characteristic of a regional architectural style that creatively synthesized Persian, Islamic, and Rajasthani design and ornamentation. For example, the baluster columns, the cusped arches, and the sloped bangladar roofs are all architectural forms that can be found in 18th century regional Indian and 17th century Mughal architecture as well. A rare example of an extant architectural drawing made by a former court painter in Jaipur, Mohanlal's drawing represents not only an increased focus on ornamentation within 19th century architectural practices, but also the significant role of formerly employed court artists in the discursive construction of a modern lexicon of architectural design in Jaipur. It is certainly telling that Mohanlal's drawing focuses on the facade of a building rather than a floor plan, substantiating the importance of surface ornamentation in 19th century building practices in Jaipur. Certainly, scholars have written about the development of an architectural paradigm in which buildings were ornamented piecemeal through the compilation of a broad range of motifs taken from divergent sources and compiled together. During his tenure as chief executive engineer in Jaipur, Samuel Swinton Jacob would employ local artists to study elements of Mughal and Rajput architecture across North India. Documenting the different features of a building, from larger components such as column types to small details such as brackets and plinth moldings, artists produced detailed drawings of decorative elements to be used as references for new building projects. From 1890 to 1913, these architectural drawings would be compiled into a 12-volume encyclopedic collection titled The Jaipur Portfolio of Architectural Details. The Jaipur Portfolio reflects the development of a modern design paradigm that emphasized the translation of ornamental motifs from stone to paper and back to stone again. I see this particular practice of isolating and mobilizing ornamental motifs across media as formative for the discursive construction of a modern visual language in late 19th century Jaipur. Here we see a decorative motif of acanthus leaves across different media. A pattern of acanthus leaves is carved into the base of a column from the Jaipur City Palace's Mubarak Mahal, which now houses the offices of the Palace Museum, built in 1899 and designed by Swinton Jacob. Similar design is included as a decorative pattern on a copper pot that was made by artists at the Jaipur School of Art and sold for 12 rupees to Frederick Horniman, an English tea trader who had traveled to Jaipur in 1894. And finally, we see the motif in a drawing from the Jaipur portfolio of a column from the early 19th century cenotaph of Maharaja Bakhtavar Singh of Alwar, located approximately 100 miles away from Jaipur. The increasing mobility of artists across different venues of artistic production thus facilitated the appropriation and mobilization of pictorial fragments from different artistic traditions into new objects and artistic paradigms. With its inclusion of new artistic patterns, including the ever-pervasive scrolling acanthus leaf motif, the shifting aesthetics of the Devi Mahatmya manuscript can thus be squarely located within the expanding artistic milieu of late 19th century Jaipur. In contrast to a body of scholarship that posits the late 19th century as a period of decline for regional Indian painting, this talk has sketched out the contours of a dynamic visual economy in late 19th century Jaipur that was shaped by the movement of artists across cultural spheres and the transmedial migrations of ornamental patterns across media and artistic genres. Thank you.
Thanks, Shivani. Can I request both our other panelists to take a seat, and we'll take your questions. First question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Renate something. You hinted at something, but then you said, "Oh well, we can't really go into this now." That was when you showed us a photograph of. Yes, and I wondered if it's at all possible to give us a hint of what you weren't able to discuss, because it's very tantalising.
Well picked up. Well, first of all, I haven't really worked on this, so I think Laura, is she gonna?
Laura's
Going to be in the panel.
Yeah.
She has written, it's an article I would recommend, but definitely, I mean, first of all, the ladies in the Zenana were not photographed and made available to the public gaze, so that's already he's breaking a rule. And then if you look at how he represents the women, if you look at the photographs, they're not, you know, the pictorial conventions in the 19th century of how you present women is a particular way of representing them as feminine and so on, and they just break all these rules. The one image I showed you, he doesn't look like he was really photographed, you know, and even showing that in a sense is already breaking the norms of how a woman is represented. And then you have to look into the particular photographs and the particular details and what kind of tropes were around for representing Indian women. There were also kind of ways of doing it. And he breaks all of them. So he just has his own particular take. Plus, for the women in the Zenana were just not photographed beforehand. So that's already a big kind of interesting element. You know, he does what he wants. Okay.
I was just thinking that you picked out an image of a woman with a sword posing with a sword in the Zenana, which was quite extraordinary as your choice in this book that we're going to be launching later. And I mean, that's an amazing photograph, actually. It's a very the woman seems to have a lot of agency in that photograph, different from some of the others he took. Some of the others, they look sort of almost subaltern, you know, he's the droit de seigneur, you have to be photographed by, you can't say no.
I feel like in the image that Miriam chose, this woman actually was quite challenging. It's interesting.
I would actually say a lot of them, the ones I've looked at, or a lot of them, I would say there is agency on the side of the woman as well. Certainly also, certainly compared to how European women would normally be represented. So I think there's a lot in there, but one has to look at the specific images.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we haven't seen them all, and I hear that there's an exhibition there was an exhibition of his work. Where was it in?
It's still on. It's still on in the gallery. But you can actually see the images if you come to Jaipur. We can show you the images on the database.
So it's in Jaipur. Great, wonderful. I'm very curious to look at.
I have to say that every time we look at it, because we had just before COVID hit, we had a workshop, Renate was there, and we actually, a bunch of us sat and put all the images up one by one and went through the whole collection. And I've been looking at this stuff for a few years now, but every time you see or revisit these images, you spot something new, you find new ways of thinking about them and interpreting them, and you put a different set of people in the room, you come up with different ideas. So it's fascinating and really rich material that you know is just there. Come and explore it.
The other thing that I'm interested in or curious about is the Bengal Photographic Society and his relationship to that. And there were women founder members in that society that I'm quite curious about. I mean, do you know anything about those women?
Well, not a huge amount, but so the...
I know slightly off the...
No, but it's just that, but the little that I know about it was because of references in the journal of the society.
Right.
And actually was able to refer to it through the good offices of a friend. So I haven't gone through the whole run myself. So it's just that there's a reference to him being a founding member, and also, I mean, this is speculation on my part because there are also details of how to acquire prints, copies of prints that were exhibited or submitted to the journal. So, you know, one can speculate on how maybe Ram Singh's images might have circulated, but I don't have any more detail than that. But it's all sitting in the BL. So
the Bengal Photographic Society didn't last for years.
So I don't know where the documents or records pertaining to that are.
The journal is whatever we have. As far as I'm aware, the most complete sort of set is in the BL, and I haven't gone through the whole thing.
I got you. You're British like.
I just haven't found the time, but it's there. Yeah.
Thank you.
An interesting question just to add to that is also why the Bengal Photographic Society. I guess it's maybe considered because it's based on Calcutta, the more important one, but there were others. There's one in Bombay, there's one in...
It was the capital, wasn't it?
Right.
The colonial...
But it was later than the other ones, I think.
1840, 1850 through 4.
I think that's a big part of it.
He attended conferences with the slideshow, and that's why we've taken that.
Because he was on the council.
And also, it's the easiest way to buy further equipment.
Yeah, and because we do have a diary, so he does actually make reference to going into shops to check out photographic chemicals. So
I'm of course also thinking of Juliet Margaret Cameron, but she wasn't doing photography at the time she was in Calcutta.
To what extent were the Zanana pictures for public consumption? Were they ever shown during his lifetime? I mean, were they privately for him?
Well, you can hear from Laura a bit later today. She has slightly different perspectives on it. But for the most part, I would say yes. Although there seems to be some evidence that some guests may have been shown these. So it's all speculation at this stage still.
No,
it certainly doesn't appear to have been.
It becomes less extraordinary as an action if it's for his own consumption.
But selectively perhaps shown to others. Ram Singh does tend to take over conversations, but I don't want to let that happen in case people have questions about other things.
Because in fact, it was your discovery, but an example exactly of that it shared
with an individual was the artist Val Prinsep being shown by Ram Singh. He's gone to Jaipur to make a portrait of him as part of a larger painting, but Ram Singh passes the time by showing him an album of his own photographs. And Val Prinsep specifically refers to an image of a dancing girl because he's taken with her and he wants to meet her and draw her. And so she's brought in for him to sketch.
Possibly for European, and showing a European is less affecting his social position.
Correct. Yeah.
It's the same thing. It looked rather real. The thinner portraits. Was in any kind of medication?
And you probably can answer this better. I think that was
Ram Singh on any kind of medication? Not that I'm aware of, as in that was.
He seemed to
He is quite skinny. I mean, we do have his garments in the collection, and they're quite small. I mean, it's also the fact historically, I think people were a bit smaller, and you can see that from the garments in the collection.
He would have been taking opium in large quantities, I should have thought.
All good Rajputs.
And the other aspect was, have you compared it with, was it the Scottish photographer Thompson and his views of ancient? Because in the 1870s, in his context, was there any kind of linkage there? Because it's more the specialist photographers and processing aspect to take account of as well. It seems to be.
In terms of what I haven't specifically looked at the Thompson photograph.
They have the welcome.
Okay.
I'm interested in how self-conscious the attributions were, and whether there's any way in which one can get at that. With Robert's weapons, he calls them Hindu and Mughal. Can one tell from, not from the objects themselves, obviously, but from representations of them and portraits or so on, whether they were perceived that way and how far they were perceived that way at the time? I'm interested similarly in Sylvia's Axminsters and chandeliers. This is a kind of, this is a prestige of a sort at the time, but it's mixed in with things which are of a very different provenance. And then there's a bleeding of the one into the other, as with the acanthus leaves. And I'm wondering about the sense of awareness of this. We look back at it and we make those attributions. We're familiar with them. At the time, was the significance, how far was the significance actually understood or even expressed deliberately for particular purposes? It's a very open-ended question, but it seems to me an interesting one in terms of perspective then and now.
Shivani, would you like to respond to that? Did you hear please comment? We can't hear you. You're muted.
You're muted.
I heard most of the question. Sorry, would you mind repeating it one more time?
Well, I was asking about how self-conscious the attributions were, and I was asking about weapons being Hindu, Muslim, Persian, and so on, but also about, enactments to carpet, a chandelier, the acanthus leaves. That these were that they were a mixture of representations and a mixture of symbolism in a way. And I wondered whether you had any feeling, any sense about how aware this was. We look back at it and we see, oh, that's what it is. We see it. But were these consciously making a statement? And I asked Robert about, weapons as represented, whether they had that, whether you could tell that that's the kind of significance. But it seems to me a question that applied just as well to enactments to carpet.
Yeah, thank you. It is a really important question. And I think, within scholarship on regional Indian painting, scholars have already emphasized the importance of citationality and reproducing established, artistic conventions and pictorial conventions. And that was a really important part of painting practice at the regional courts. And so the idea of intentionality then is, it's a tricky one because, of course, there is, I think, a certain degree of agency and creative liberties that artists could take. But at the same time, they were also following these established conventions of painting and often reproducing specific iconographies and typologies. But for me, and that's why I find Mohanlal's archive so fascinating, because one can actually see the ways in which a single artist, did diversify their working methods in order to really respond to the, changing art market, essentially, and the changing context of artistic production. And so you can actually see the ways in which, and I didn't include examples of his work that were made for the court, but you can see the ways in which he's actually, changing his techniques in accordance with what is, necessary for whoever is commissioning the work, whether that's for an architectural drawing or whether that's for a photographic style portrait. And so I think there one can really see this this sense of agency of, artists in shaping these new aesthetic practices. I don't really use the word, I guess, intentionality. It's hard to get a sense of intentionality, but I think in terms of the ways in which artists themselves were really active agents in shaping, new aesthetic and design practices, I see that really clearly in Mohanlal's work. Yeah.
I start from the position of the Maharaja, where it is as a patron in the decisions taken. I think that they dictated. I think that it depends what objects you're talking about, and that their treatment by the Maharaja differs. A good example, I think, is chandeliers, where they were a huge status symbol. You have lots of stories about Maharajas going into shops in Calcutta, buying the entire contents, every single one. I've been into palaces in the Punjab, and there's a lovely story I was told in Baroda about an architect telling the Maharaja that the chandelier he wanted for the dining room was much too heavy and the ceiling wouldn't support it. He said, nonsense. An elephant hoisted up to prove that it would take the weight. I mean, it was a matter of status to have the biggest chandelier for him, and to have lots of them was also a matter of status. So there, I think, the architect wouldn't necessarily have chosen it, but the chandelier was something that was important to the status of the Maharaja. With regard to weapons, I think you have a different culture whether you're talking about Muslim or Hindu. From a Hindu point of view, you work very hard to make sure the goddess entered your weapon. You designed it so that it was attractive for the goddess to enter, and you gave it perfume every year to make it more attractive, which you can still buy, and all that sort of stuff. So from his point of view, the sword was the most important thing, and you swore on it, you made oaths on it, and then it was absolutely binding. I don't think for a Muslim you had the same sort of relationship with your sword. I'm sure it's important, but it wasn't the same thing. But of course the thing is immensely complicated by what people pick up. And as I tried to explain, I think the thing gets slightly muddled in terms of styles when you get down to the Deccan and Aurangzeb's wars, where you had Muslim fighting Muslim, much to the dismay of the ulama. You had people picking up stuff, and the culture had come running close enough together. But what you actually took onto the battlefield, if you were a Hindu, I think wasn't necessarily, well, at least a Rajput, Bhagya Rajput, not take some Muslim sword onto the battlefield, even if it was a present from the emperor. That's my personal guess. It's not a certainty. But what you want are things that are dated from in my field. So you can say this is this date, is the decoration, is the hilt original, or has it been added to the blade, all this sort of consideration. Has the decoration been changed? There's clearly was a lot of stuff done of that kind in the 19th century. And so it goes on. And the one thing that I would really caution is that you cannot rely on most of the published sources in this country on my metalwork. The most unreliable.
Does anyone else have a question? Or I have one for Robert.
Question for Robert, actually.
Please go ahead.
You know, after hearing your presentation, I have to say I haven't ever really thought about swords and hilts and daggers. That's a new world for me. But noticing then the photographs, I showed these two photographs where the Maharaja of Orcha was presented with his, because you mentioned you couldn't, for some reason, you didn't find the swords in the Rajput court, but in the image, they were clearly the swords. So I wanted to sort of comment on that to ask you if...
They carried on wearing swords. Part of the problem was that by the time you get to the 19th century, you have people wanting to wear their ancestors' swords. And they're big, heavy things because they had to be, because you were cutting through armour in the 17th century. It needed to be pretty solid. And the Rajputs trained like mad with dumbbells and things to be strong enough to use them. And they took opium too, which helped them. But when you get into the age of gunpowder, it ceases to be quite the same thing. You can have a much lighter sword, which will do the business just as well. This isn't such a clunky thing to carry around. But the Rajputs are immensely proud of family. You have people to this day who wander up to aristocratic Rajputs and start reciting their ancestry, and you have to pay them to go away and stop. And it still goes on. I've seen it done. They add on the new generations as they're born. It's very impressive. So ownership of the sword, your ancestor's sword, is very important. They believe that prowess is transmitted through blood and semen, actually, and that it was possible that if your ancestor was a great warrior, you would be a great warrior automatically. So the sword is a manifestation of this, and it's their most important possession. The jokes about a moustache, a sword, and a horse are the three things that matter to a Rajput. So you got to court in the 19th century, and you probably put a lighter hilt on. Because the big hilts would go with those very heavy swords. You saw it, Norbert, you wouldn't have a tennis racket. You have to go to play. They were so heavy that you wanted a lighter hilt on, try and cut the weight, because there you're lucky to sit around and cocktail bottle, whatever it is, in the 18th century, 19th century, the parties would attend the Maharaja and do a killer. And so they started putting lighter hilts on. And of course, to represent your status, you decorated that hilt. As the 19th century progresses, you decorated it more and more. The fashion changed, as it did in Victorian England. And one of the points about the Victorian tourists coming to India is they weren't prepared to put up with the old-fashioned sword with very little decoration. They didn't think they're getting their money's worth out of the man who's selling to them. So they asked for decoration to be added. And if you look at, I think it's Henley, he says, whenever a Maharaja gets a new weapon, a new gun, or a new gun from London, that's it. And he promptly takes it and has it decorated as much gold cutlery as you can spot onto it, because that's what he thinks looks good. And it reflects his status and the flashy gold and stuff. Unfortunately, that's the stuff that the Arabs tend to want to buy. So there is that benefit in the market today. But so what you've got are things that are additions, but it suits the commercial world to pretend that they're the originals. So it has good things like that.
As you can tell, Robert can't keep going on about the answer. So I'm going to hold my question because
20 minutes of good summer.
I will hold on my question. Just a comment on something that the contrast between Shivani's and Robert's presentation, where in Robert's view everything is going downhill in the 19th century, but Shivani's presentation things are being, it's sort of reinvented. It's a kind of continuation of a Jaipur tradition of reinventing for every new era. So with that, I will hand over to Giles, who will close today's formal academic session with his comments. Yeah.
So you can all see that I'm typing into the online facilities because it's.
I need to do something for that. I'm not sure.
Like a genie in the lamp.
Yeah. Actually, be very brief. The heterogeneous nature of the collections of the City Palace, in one sense, is rather surprising when you consider that everything that we have in the City Palace collection comes from the same source, or two sources if you count father and son as two people, as they were. Everything was either given to the trust by Maharaja Singh II in 1959 or by his son, Singh, in 1971. And they're all from the private collection. So all the material is from one source, and it's from a fairly limited time period as well, although, as you've seen, we have a number of pieces that date as far back as the 17th century. By far the majority of pieces in the collection are either 18th or 19th or early 20th century, which in Indian terms is rather a narrow window of time. But nevertheless, it's extraordinarily diverse in nature. So even just in the course of 9 papers today, we have ranged over both Mughal and Rajput painting, both courtly and sacred. We have considered esoteric Sanskrit texts. We have been shown images and texts relating to the musical and literary culture of the court. We have looked at textiles that have come from all parts of South Asia and beyond. We've been shown arms of diverse types and sources and examples of early photography. And the challenge of working in the museum, particularly with a very small staff, is that none of us can be expert in all of this. It's very difficult for any of us to move even across this great breadth. And so we have been, when Mrinalini and I are working on it with our team, have been heavily dependent on experts from outside who come to look at particular things, including all of the speakers you've heard today. And so they contribute to our knowledge, each within his or her own area of expertise, knowledge which we can then pass on to our visitors through the ways in which we caption things. And it's that, but then each individual remains an individual. It's where they come and look at one thing, as Mrinalini was saying earlier, pointing earlier about that we all have our kind of little furrow. So they each look at things within their area of expertise and then go away again. And part of the point of the book Masterpieces, and by extension of this symposium, is to try to bring it all together again. I can't remember the origin of that, the metaphor of the committee examining an elephant, and everybody examines a different bit, and they all come up with a radically different conclusion. So the point to say is to put it together. The book brings 75 perspectives together. We've today brought 9 perspectives together in the hope that it begins to flesh out, and that we can see each other's insights into the collection. So if I could just review those perspectives, as it were, in a sentence each, just as a sort of recap and reminder of where we've gone in the course of the day. Ursula's opening paper revisited a very good example of the whole process, because she came to look at the paintings and immediately corrected an error that we had made. To begin with, as she began the paper, I was somewhat dismayed to discover that it was unsettled yet again, that she's now questioning her own reattribution of the painting. But in a sense, that's just an example of how things go, that it never ends. So there's always a further contextualization, a further example which gives you a different perspective. So thank you, Ursula, for coming back to the battle for iron problem and for unsettling it all again. Jim Allison's discovery was a classic City Palace experience. We went to the Jaipur Tree Festival when he was there one year and said, I don't believe you've seen this collection. Come and have a look, at least go through the online, it's not online, but the computerized list of the Sanskrit manuscripts. And he said, well, if that's what it says it is, then it's going to be extraordinarily interesting. I mean, the chances are that it isn't, but it was. And I have to say that wasn't the only, and he explained, I needn't go over the importance of the Yoga Vasana. But that's not the only example of such a thing happening. I think, honestly, my memory has conflated it as the same year, the same week that we did the same exercise with Supriya Gandhi, who had recently completed her biography of Dara Shikoh. And in fact, it was Aparna who was about to appear later, our colleague who said, well, we have a portrait of him in a maraca. Come and have a look at it. And she came and she looked, and I didn't think she was enormously impressed by the painting, but she turned it over and started to read the Persian calligraphy on the back. And she said that this is an extract from the personal spiritual memoir of Jahanara, Dara's sister. And the importance of that text is, I can recognize it because there is a 20th century published version of the text, which is based on a manuscript in Ahmedabad, which is now lost. So you now have the only remaining manuscript of that text. And so on and on. And there's another one that kind of is the interstices between those two, which is a Persian translation of a text about Dara Shikoh, which again is a spiritual inquiry. A text normally known in Persian, but in our version it's in Sanskrit. I'll come back to the importance of that in my final comment. But I've wandered away from today. Catherine Butler-Schofield particularly pleased us because, as we invited contributors to do, she challenged the idea of a masterpiece. I mean, you know, for me, a masterpiece is the Ruslia painting, the 13-foot, you know, enormous thing that's half gold. For Catherine Butler-Schofield, it was a little scrappy drawing, a little rather unimpressive portrait, except that they are masterpieces because they're impressive in a surprising way. What they do is they, as she explained, move beyond the generic image of the courtly performer. We're all familiar with all paintings which show the Raja, who might be an individual, but in confronting a singer, dancers, musicians who are just generic. And here they become portraits of real people, people with names. And there's much more of that in Jaipur. I mean, obviously those two drawings are of particular interest to a musicologist, but there's a whole series of drawings by Ramji Das and his associates that date from the early to mid 19th century, which show the ordinary people of the court. You know, they show barbers and people who are assigned to look after children and so on and so forth. It's almost as though the court was documented quite deliberately, rather as Akbar ordered his artists to document his own, but he was documenting the nobles of his court. Here it's the ordinary people of the court. And of course, that project is picked up much later by Ram Singh as the photographer. Richard's paper, yes, begins to unpack the complexities of the Jayaramji Mahakarya. I just want to pick up one point you made there, which is this sort of wonderful paradox at the heart of what you said, that here is Jagat Singh, who becomes notorious and indeed unpopular even among his own courtiers for his devotion to a single woman, mostly because she seems unsuitable. And ironically, the text seeks to portray him as appropriately polyamorous, but he's doing this in a colonial era when the values are shifting. It's a fascinating problem, I think, about sort of changing values. I wanted to add when we were discussing this, that of course, that part of the problem, I think you hinted at this, that the problem with Ras Kapoor is, and indeed of the attention to one woman, is that it would be unpopular among the male relatives of the legitimate queens. That's the real point, because they're competing for influence, and they do that by having their sister or cousin or relatives as the favourite wife and the mother of the heir. And of course, that's all swept aside by the elevation of Ras Kapoor. There's a nice little linguistic twist on this. Ras Kapoor, of course, means essence of camphor. Todd rather pedantically retranslates it as corrosive sublimate. Just Sylvia, in her very, very delicate and subtle unpacking of this lovely little fragment of textile, I just want to pick up one thing here, which is where she relates the motif to architecture. She compares this little floral scroll to a bit of marble carved relief of the Palace of Amber, which is a reminder of the way in which sometimes indeed courtly culture in the high Mughal period was rather stiff. There's a whole book by Sue Strong actually talking about this in the Mughal court, the way in which the same motifs go across all sorts of media. It starts really as an art in the book, but it flows out of the book into architecture, into glassware, into metalware, into textiles, and so on and so forth. And so Sylvia's paper was a reminder here of the connection between textiles and architecture, but also indeed, as we later saw, to arms and armour. You saw the same motifs appearing. Robert, again, reminds us that this is a recurring motif, a recurring idea in discussions of Jaipur about the assimilation of the Mughal world, or the interplay between the Rajput and Mughal worlds, in his case, through the medium of arms. I think that the final example that you showed us, which you obviously disapprove of, I think is rather a subtle piece. It was made for Sawai Singh, but for the period when he was attending the coronation in London. Of course, he had a magnificent sword made to present to the king on that occasion, and was pleased the king actually wore it at a parade. But that's the piece I think he made to take with him. There is a further connection which we didn't explore between photography and arms in the Jaipur collection through a series of photographs of sword hilts, which actually Robert has used some of them, which puzzled us at first because they seemed very much to suggest a curator's gaze rather than a regal gaze. There wasn't a regal view of arms. It looked like they'd been taken by a museum curator. And then we discovered in the Henley Diary, which is in the V&A collection, a reference to being allowed to photograph arms in the city palace in 1888. So it's after the death of Ram Singh. Those photographs can't have been by Ram Singh. They were by Henry himself.
The king wearing a sword given to him by Jaipur is a good example of the royal adoption of a status symbol to please a particular category of people.
Exactly. So, coming to Renate, so Mrinalini and I have had, as it were, a project in collusion with Reha Balana of the Al-Qazi Foundation to establish Sawai Ram Singh as a major 19th century artist of India, not just as a ruler. So I was delighted that Renate is prepared to take the project a step further and to show him not just as an artist, but as a subversive artist, one who overthrows or at least challenges the conventions of his time, and even as a precursor of the avant-garde. Whether you will all get along with her on that route, I think a larger point is, as it were, to try to decenter the history of art and to think that we might actually, instead of always looking at Indian art, look at a Western point of reference to anchor ourselves, if we could perhaps sometimes do the project the other way around. And I will certainly go with you on that path. And then finally, Shivani Sud, who shows us the extraordinary wealth of the visual material from the 19th century, and indeed the high quality of work from a period that is too often dismissed as decadent. The commercialization of the arts of that period, which is the thing that's particularly interested me, in some way, I think, it seems to me to bring new vigor to it. And I particularly appreciate the way in which Shivani underlines the point that the hybridity of the period, of the art of the period, can be seen as a sign of creative choice rather than one of cultural decline. So in looking at all of these objects, my final point is to say that some of the objects discussed refer us back to the world of Amber Jaipur, like Sylvia and her connecting the motif with the textile with the Palace of Amber. But others look in other different directions, particularly some of the manuscripts. Indeed, the missing paper today was going to make that exactly that point. What I was going to talk about was the way in which a famous Persian manuscript in the Jaipur Court, and what's it doing there? Well, it's there in order to educate a young Rajput prince and to teach him Persian, the court language. And I think that's the ultimate point that Renate and I were trying to get at with this title, Cultural Worlds of the Jaipur Court, is the way in which this, indeed, heterogeneous material looks in several different directions at once. It connects up very strongly with the sort of the Vaishnavite world of Jaipur through things like the Yoga Bhaskara and some of the paintings that I was discussing. But it also, at the same time, looks outward to the Persian world of the time through the Mughal court. And Jaipur uniquely stands. I mean, obviously, any Rajput kingdom of the period would have to engage with these two worlds. The extraordinary strength of the material in Jaipur that does this in this superlative way, I think, is what makes this collection so exciting.
Thank
you, Giles. And,
I should end by thanking all of our contributors and particularly Alison for hosting us.
Thank you, everyone. Alison, do you reconvene at 5 or 5:05? Yes, so maybe we can push it by 5 minutes. Yes, okay. So we reconvene at 5:05 for a panel discussion with Giles, Karen, and we have Aparna and Laura joining us virtually online. any actually
It's so that you see yourself as you see yourself in the mirror, so you don't freak out on what you really look like.
It just confuses me. Somewhere it's not fair. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panelists who are patiently waiting online without a session of Christmas and wine. I hand over to Giles to take over and steer our panel discussion. We have joining us Dr. Laura Weinstein, I always get the pronunciation of your name wrong, sorry Laura, who is based at the NFA, and we've got Aparna Andhare, who is, as Giles mentioned, our former colleague at the City Council, and of course we've got Karen and Giles in person. But, you know, there are so many of us in the room who contributed to the book, so if you feel the need to, you know, pitch in, please feel free to do so. Thank you. Yeah.
So much more to the book launch, which is our concluding session today. It's a particular pleasure to Karen Lewis, who though not lacking scholarly credentials, comes from a collection from a different perspective. She's actually one of two creative artists who contributed to the book, not by writing a piece, but by doing an image. And so I think we'd like to talk a bit about her own photographic practice in Jaipur in particular, and perhaps to connect it to other areas of photography, historical photography that we do. Everything.
Thank you, Giles, and thank you everybody for inviting me here. So the first time I've been in the Royal Asiatic Society. So it's my first time. Can I control it? Yeah.
Or is it take the mask over there? That should work.
Okay, let me just get my glasses. Okay. It would be a good idea, don't you think? Yeah, here we go.
Thank you. I can't see your PowerPoint. Can we load her PowerPoint? I can't see it.
I'll just put
There we go. Okay. It's not private,
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Your full screen.
Yeah, sorry, let me do that.
Slideshow. Thank you. I'm not doing a very long slideshow. I'm going to rush through this quite quickly. But I thought it was really important for me to contextualize my photographic practice, which I've been now doing for over 40 years. And I've always I think the main focus of the work has always been a sort of transgression and questioning, challenging of power, whether it's on my own family background, whether it's, let's say the aristocratic order of things in Britain or in India. There's always been that transgressive element, whether it's the animals that get placed in interiors more recently, or image and text from the 1970s to the 2000s, actually, and also a challenging of the academy and museology. So I'm very interested in all these different fields, and I've tried to address them in some way in my photographic practice. So I'm just going to click, and here we go. This is just to contextualize my work in India, called India Song, which is probably my most popular work today. And actually that work owes a lot to Miriam, whom I met in Udaipur back in 2009 when she was shuffling around a bit of the archive there and that next door room, which I'll show you an image that I ended making of that room, which was unfinished and was being fixed. Use that image. This is work that I did in Le Musée Carnavalet in Paris from 2003 to 2007, not just in this museum, but what happened was I was always fascinated by the space and by the fact that I could hear sounds of like pigeons and others outside, thinking of animal life maybe behind the scenes, but also here, this is called fables, thinking of Aesop, thinking of, different La Fontaine, and bringing that animal into the space as both something, an animal, of course, would shit and pee in these spaces if they were allowed to come in, like our pets sometimes do. And of course, I wanted to challenge this museum space, okay, which is basically a decorative arts museum. And all these photographs, I took quite a few photographs on the first floor. So the next photograph is in Chambord, again, using, this time, these are taxidermized animals. So effectively, I'm photographing dead cadaver animals in spaces, using animals from their own collections and moving them around. Sometimes, like the previous one, borrowing animals, photographing them separately, and then inserting them digitally into the space. So these photos, in this one, it's like it was taken with an analog 5.4 camera. There's no digital manipulation actually in this one. But so the work also mapped the transition from analog to digital. I work fully digitally now. So just to show you just a little hint of that past work, a lot of it can be found on my website. And the India Song works have been really very, very important to me because I discovered India in 2008 on a 2,000-mile road trip, went with a friend, and just went through Rajasthan and discovered all these sites that I then went back and photographed for the next 10 years. It's quite complicated to get permission. Some of them are heritage hotels. In some ways, that was easier, like Sunwood Palace here. But then, meeting the right people to get the permission was, took time. So this is that photograph that I took in the room that Miriam was right next to. And I remember you saying, but it's slightly dusty and has the window panes out there. And I just really love the documentary and realistic, impulse of photography. And I've always sort of been one of those conceptual photographers, I guess, who's interested in documentary fiction. So I see these works as, in a way, documents, but of course they're allegorical. There's a bit of magical realism and surrealism in it. And what I started doing is photographing live animals in wherever I could find them in India, and they walk around you in India, including zoos and parks and reserves, and then insert them into these palaces. This one is in Udaipur. And of course, this one is, and it was very difficult to access to Chandra Mahal initially in the earlier days. And I was very pleased to have got it before they put all those lights in. Now they have lights, these
I think they're trying to emulate an environment in the evening, I think, or something, which I got it anyway. So I photographed this room in Chandra Mahal with my Sinar camera. I then scanned it and mixed it up with a cheetah that I found in zoo. Because cheetahs are extinct, cheetahs weren't actually indigenous totally to India. They came from Persia, I think. There's this debate about them. They tried to reintroduce them, never happened, did it? I mean, there was a story of them. I think, wow, but they need such great territory. So they're doing corridors in the Amur Valley Mountains. Oh my goodness, it's come to be. Okay, another room as well. And actually it's a side room. And I'm always very interested in these palaces, in the side rooms, and maybe the rooms that people don't see or don't notice. Or adjacent to their grounds. So this one is taken in Dungapur, the Jinnah Mahal, which is extraordinary treasure house, really, full of these extraordinary miniature paintings and photographs embedded in the wall. I mean, it's sort of, at the moment, it's fragile. So the work is also about the fragility of nature and of animal life as much as of the heritage that it finds itself in. And he says, this is in Shekhawati. This is in the Pudar Haveli, which is one of the Havelis that has been sort of transformed into a museum, but it's quite extraordinary. And this comes from a more recent trip, 2020, February 2020. I went back and took photographs in upstairs. This is the Zenana bit of the Dungapur palace. I don't know. Have you visited? Yes, extraordinary. Yeah. And this one, of course, this extraordinary room in where is it? Is it in Bikaner? Yeah, where this room is like a little jewel chest. You know, it was very difficult to make it, photograph it properly like this, yeah, without any distortion. And of course, the wonderful black buck, which is now very rare out in the desert, but you can find in zoos. And more recently, this one in amber or amer. I don't know is it amer or amber? It's so I think it's British as amber, right?
It's not official.
It's the official one, yeah, okay.
Okay, sorry.
So again, a more recent one that I took in Dungapur Palace. So again, the whole idea is, by accident, I became a wildlife photographer. You know, and I've done portraits, I've done stuff like that within my early black and white conceptual image and text work. But now, I mean, the fact that these wonderful animals are maybe not, you know, are quite rare, some under threat, is even more, for me, more tantalizing to you know, try and visit them or view them. I'm not into the darshan moment of deity. Maybe the darshan moment of wildlife is close to that. Oops, how do I do this? I don't know what to prep. Ah, here it is, yeah. And again, this extraordinary, I mean, I got totally obsessed by this palace. I photographed practically every room I could. Some of it smelled of bat dung, extraordinary place. The family, and also referencing here the Ragamala by the title. If you're thinking of those Ragamala miniatures of women pining for their men, here is a story of a lion and a peacock who, you know, sort of shift the gender sort of scenario of that idea. So I liked working with titles that allude to miniatures and stories. And of course, when I went to India, I got totally obsessed also about the origin stories, which are the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And there are little touches in the titles alluding to sections in the story, like that section where, you know, she's deceived, he's deceived by thinking that's a golden deer, and then she gets kidnapped, Sita, and that's a very long story. But what I love about these spaces as well is that the animals serve as a foil to the architectural space. There's this tension between the two, and hopefully, and the detail in this building is extraordinary. And what I noticed when I first came to India was there weren't many pictures of the interiors. There was a lot of pictures about, you know, the abject poverty or hagiographical portraits of the aristocracy. And I don't know, I was trying to find a different space. I was fascinated by the hybridity as well. And these are just some of the more recent ones I put together during COVID. Yeah, I went into my archive and from my last trips put together some works. I just thought I would show you some of them here. And of course the sizes are unnatural and illusionistic because I have to sort of find a place for the, you know, that Sarah's crane to look like it could live there, and somehow it's almost plausible, but of course not. Do I what? Why isn't this? I don't see. And here's this me in one of my recent shows, maybe my first solo show in a long time in the UK. I show a lot worldwide, but not much in the UK, with Augusta Edwards, who represents my work at Cromwell Place in October 2021. So this is giving you an idea of the scale of how the work is presented. And then just very quickly going through, you know, my relationship to contemporary Indian photography. You know, my work was really very lucky to have friends like Sunil who supported my work in India at a very early age when I first started, and I presented it to quite a few places thanks to him, and how important actually this work has become. I think he's maybe preparing for another museum show in Sweden now. So I wanted to show you some of his work too that he had done, reinventing the pre-Raphaelites. And I was also thinking in the paper about sex and education, whether anything had been come across that wasn't heterosexual and so normative, whether there, you know, if you can find that let's say transgression or challenge in Hijras, for example, or in some Gori dancers, let's say in Udaipur, is there any sense that there's any presence of that in text is what I would ask. Seeing, you know, from a Foucauldian perspective as well, I mean, that could be an interesting bit of research anyway. So, yeah, and Sunil's just launched a new book of writings published by Aperture right now in the Bristol Festival of Books up in Martin Parr's Foundation. Some of the work that he addresses, it's his work, the new pre-Raphaelites. And then Gauri Gill, of course, wonderful, who collaborates with villagers and families where they're carving the masks and wearing them and posing for photographs in her work. So these are the works that, you know, I'm engaging with more, I guess, though I've just recently really discovered the work of Sawai Ram Singh. So I really look forward to seeing more and looking closely at this work, which I wasn't really that aware of. But here's just some of the works. I mean, Indian photography, when I first had my exhibition with Tasvir in 2010, was just beginning, and now it seems to be thriving quite a bit, although I noticed the photo festivals have died down a little bit. Of course, COVID has interrupted everything. So, and this photographer is based in France, has reinterpreted the origin stories in a totally different way. It has a very long ongoing work in several sections and books. And of course, the work of Dayanita Singh, which everybody now knows, is so important internationally. Thank you.
Aparna, are you there? Move on to some images to show us.
I think that's much.
You need to. Are you muted? Can you speak?
We can't hear you, Giles. You need to move
close to the mic.
Okay, I can hear you. Fine. Would you like to, if I could introduce Aparna Andhare, who works with us as a curator in the City Palace for a number of years, and is now based in Pune, working on independent projects. But is going to, you have a presentation to review some of your favourite objects and thoughts about the collection.
All right, thank you, Giles, for having me. It's always such a pleasure to listen to everyone talk about Jaipur, especially this crowd. So I wish I were there in the room with a glass of wine. That would have been great. So while I was in Jaipur, we were working on the transport gallery, and we found that there were several stories that objects, pre-motorized transport, would tell us, and some of these were rather fabulous. Now, Jaipur, as we know, is a city that really likes its processions, and it's a city that, sorry, I'm going to put this on slideshow. There we are. It really likes its processions, and we know this because we also have these fabulous friezes in the on the cenotaph of Sawai Madho Singh II, and you can see the Hawa Mahal in Jaipur. We can see camels, we can see processions. We have a buggy similar to the one that you see on the lower image in the collection. These are times when you've got people from all over the world, where history and tradition really interact with what's happening everywhere, especially in Europe. So we found that there were stories that objects in the collection were telling us, and one of the most fascinating objects we have, and which is probably going to be a highlight of our of the transport gallery. I still say I haven't sort of separated myself from Jaipur yet, but one of those things that we have is the Takht-e-Rawan. So it's a mobile throne. You can see Sawai Man Singh II being carried on it. The Chhatri is there, which is another mark of royalty. And this is a throne that would basically, that he would sit on and then would move. I think we can make out the city palace in the background. The Takht-e-Rawan is fascinating, not only for its motifs. We have mythical beasts. You've got fantastical beasts that sort of hold the takht together. We have elephants. You have tigers, and then these beautiful scrolls that decorate the throne. Motifs are being borrowed from Mughal art, they're being borrowed from Rajput traditions, they come in from Europe. So essentially the world sort of combines itself to make a statement of power within an object like this one. You will remember pictures of paintings of Aurangzeb being carried on a palanquin. This one's from the Met, and it's a similar takht. So Takht-e-Rawan is a mobile throne. It's a throne that can be carried, and therefore the ideas of kingship, which are sort of find home in the person of the ruler, they get carried throughout with these accoutrements. This is just these are just a couple of pictures of the takht. It's a wooden base with rattan, and then it gets embellished with silver, and then and different metals come together, and is quite fabulously finished with large cushions. So Giles, that's it from me, and taking you through on this whirlwind sort of, you know, tour of two of our favorite objects, and focusing on the takht.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. So, but stay on hold, and let's move to, let's bring in Laura, if we can. Laura, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Laura has visited us on a number of occasions, and wrote a very important early article, actually before any of us got going on the Ram Singh archive, with an important interpretation of some of the images of women. But what are you going to talk to us about? Have you got, do you have slides, or would you like to?
I do have slides.
Then show us the slide.
Okay. So, I first made my first trip to Jaipur in 2000, and for me that feels like a very long time ago. Although I know some of you have been going there for many more decades. But from the very beginning, I've been interested in Ram Singh and his photographs, and that led me in to do this article in 2010. But more recently, I've been so thrilled to come back to Jaipur because of invitations from Giles and Mrinalini to kind of come back to these amazing photographs. I'm showing you here photographs of one particular woman in different costume, and I think of her as being in kind of different guises, and that has just been something that's fascinated me from the very beginning. The idea that we're getting not only through these photographs a view of women that may not have had much of a public presence outside of the photographs and outside of the Jaipur Palace, but also the idea that the women, as you see here, can kind of exercise some agency and creativity through the way they look at the camera, through wearing different costumes, through their pose. And so that encounter that we experience when we see the images is just fascinating to me. Giles gave me the great question of sort of how do you think about photographs like these in relation to painting? And I'm so glad he did, because it made me realize that I have often separated them in my mind kind of unnecessarily. And that really is sort of silly, not only because of painted photographs, for example, but also because I had this idea sort of fixed that like women in something like a Jaipur painting would tend to be really just generic, a type, as opposed to the photographs that give me this stronger sense of specificity. But looking at paintings that are in the Jaipur City Palace collection, looking at the book that Mrinalini and Giles have edited, which contains some wonderful paintings, you start to see, for example, with Ratni Bhagtan on the left here, that the paintings also contain glimpses of specific and intriguing female figures. And so I'm juxtaposing two here, just so neither of these women are looking at us, but they both have, I think, an incredible presence and specificity, even though we may not know very much about them, we may not know their specific identity, and they certainly have presence. Also, thinking about that specificity, I'm reminded that the idea that physiognomic specificity is necessary to make a portrait is something really Western in origin. And so again, when we look at a painting like this one on the right from the Jaipur Museum, you can see that there is a real attempt to give a specific costume, the intensity of the eye, the headgear, the instrument. When I look at it alongside these photographs by Sawai Ram Singh, I begin to think about how presence is there in the individual, whether or not you have the face exactly that is specific. I think of these as figures who maybe they know they're being watched, but they are not allowing themselves necessarily to be turned into objects. They are still very much subjects. I have then, because I work at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, I've been turning back to the MFA's own collection and finding that there are paintings of the kinds of figures that appear in Sawai Ram Singh's photographs of women, just sitting under my nose, that I haven't necessarily looked at before in this way and thought about how they may communicate presence or how they may represent even a specific performer. And so that has been a wonderful provocation to go back and look at the collection that I steward. I have no doubt that the artists who made the images that we're looking at here, at some points they probably did practice over and over the profile of a female figure or the pose of a dancing figure. But at the same time, there are so many works like these. Let me see if I have another one here. this is an intriguing one. Anyway, there's so many images of dancers when you start looking, dancers and female performers, that surely they are all saying something specific. They are different. And with this particular example, I'm going to need to go into storage and look at it more closely to see if I can figure out what is going on with the lower half of her body. Is there something pricked there that that if I look very closely, I'll find the holes that will tell me what the lower body was intended to be doing. It's very intriguing. And that brings me kind of to thinking about the artist's practice and to this guy, Sahib Ram. This is a portrait in the Museum of Fine Arts collection. And I love to, I'm thinking now, because again of this question about photography and painting, thinking about what is he looking at as he's drawing there? Is he looking at a model, or is he thinking about some kind of inner vision? And is it then therefore some kind of Platonic type, or maybe is it that he is actually observing something specific? We have these works attributed to Sahib Ram in the Boston collection. These are, dated to around 1800. Towards the end of his career, and these are, of course, cartoons or preparatory material working towards the monumental painting that is in Jaipur today, showing Krishna Leela. And scholars have pointed out, maybe you are familiar with this painting, but scholars have certainly pointed out that the figure on the right, who is the Krishna figure, seems to be a woman based on the dress and the hair. And in the wonderful new masterpieces Jaipur book, we have Molly Aitken fascinatingly saying that she thinks not that it's necessarily a woman dressed as Krishna, but actually a woman becoming Krishna, which is a suggestion that I love. And so here I'm showing you the cartoon that's in Boston next to a detail of the painting in Jaipur, and you can look and compare them yourselves, which I love to do. And basically what I'm kind of trying to allude to a little bit is that bringing together, thinking about photography and painting alongside each other, especially images of women, brings me to kind of noting the fluidity, really, between in the photographs and in the paintings, between kind of the singular human being and the generic type of human being, and even the God, as we see here. There is a kind of oscillation between these different types that all kinds of portraiture, painting, and photography can allow. It makes me think about how sitting for a portrait is actually kind of both giving and taking in an interesting way, that one of these dancers, performers, sitting for a portrait was perhaps allowing an artist to reduce their uniqueness down to a sort of set of certain details that would certainly leave something out. And on the other hand, sitting for a portrait is being immortalized, monumentalized. Actually, that makes me think about Karen, your wonderful animals who become something so much larger than themselves in your photographs. So these are just some thoughts that I wanted to share about connecting Boston and Jaipur, about some of the objects that have brought me again and again to think about the works in the Jaipur collection, the photographs and the paintings. And I just want to thank you. Jaipur was the very first place that I called home in my first trip to India, and I always want to keep returning there. So thank you.
Drawing attention to the connections between Jaipur and other museum connections around the Swami collection. Time Jaipur connecting these works by Sahibra, works by Sahibra, there's an doubt in museum fine arts, which all about the sites.
So that brings me to a question that I had for the panel, inviting inputs, feedback, thoughts from everyone in the room, which is about the challenges and opportunities presented by having collections scattered as they are. So, I was struck in Ursula's presentation this morning of the dizzying area, not just of paintings, but of where they are. and I couldn't keep track of them. And it's, yeah, I kind of thought, how is she actually just getting the institution sorted in my head would take a lot of time. How is she also managing to sort out the paintings? So that's kind of the thought from where the question is coming from. But I also thought perhaps the colleagues might want to highlight opportunities that this sort of spread provides. So I don't know who wants to go first, but any thoughts?
Can I say?
Yes, of course.
I think my thought is that really the provisions online now are amazing. And although they're not the real work, you know, you're not in front of the work, nonetheless, that's the way in which we're all connected. We can see what we have, and I think every museum has a responsibility to put their collections online and to get high quality JPEGs. So we can see these online if we can't travel.
Indeed, and I'm afraid we don't do well on that score in Jaipur. So books like this one and the other books in the series are our attempt to address that particular gap, the shortcoming. I mean, obviously you can't print everything and put in the book, but you can at least try to snapshot. But that's certainly an opportunity for collaboration, I think, that we have, and that's facilitated a lot of the work that we've been able to do, whether it's, you know, sending Richard the journals of Maharaja so that he can read it sitting in London, or whichever way. But any other thoughts or comments about, you know, the challenges and opportunities that this particular mode of working and indeed this sort of spread may offer? Renate?
Yeah, to me, what's really striking is the question of relationality. Because quite often we're focused on objects and particular historic details, the provenance and whatever, but what this kind of spread really helps us trace, or maybe not trace, at least talk about, is circulation, relationality, which is really where you get your finger on the pulse of culture, the kind of meaning question was raised at the end of the last session. You know, what does it mean to have this Axminster carpet in this kind of miniature? What does it tell us about what was going on at the time? And this is made it's really interesting, I find, and also to kind of help us trace maybe changes in these cultures of exchange, circulation, appropriation, whatever you want to call it. And to me, that's really another opportunity and challenge. It will always remain challenging because so many questions we can't answer. But nonetheless, it's intriguing and it's important to create that context. Yeah. So that's an opportunity.
Anyone online? Laura? Aparna? All of you are welcome to jump in.
I thought I would just say that if I understand, I'm not sure I heard the last comment correctly, but it's very intriguing to me that the Sahib Ram drawings that I showed you, came out of the Jaipur collection and to Boston in probably about, well, they must have left Jaipur sometime around 1905. And the division of that collection, you can see in that some kind of interesting circulation that then made such a huge impact in the US and helped enormously to kind of communicate the importance of Indian art on the US side, but now it does feel important to bring them back together in whatever ways we can, because it's impossible to understand the Boston collections without Jaipur.
I just want to follow on from that and say it's actually incredible to be able to make connections now because of so much online material between various different things. And one of the things I've been on the hunt for entirely separately from this are paintings of Lucknow courtesans from the 1780s, and just purely by accident came across a random Polier album in the Bibliothèque Nationale rather than in Berlin, where most of them are, which actually had the cartoon for the famous painting that I think is of Khanam Jan, which is there's two copies, one in the Rietberg and in Zurich, and one in the Aga Khan collection. And those connections can be made because of, online presence. Nobody had seen this cartoon before. But the other thing that really struck me, and thank you, Laura, for speaking about the musicians in your in the MFA, because I've never looked at them before. Now I've discovered that you've got hundreds of of them. It's really interesting in terms of the volume that four of us, Giles, myself, Laura, and of course Molly, who's not with us, but who wrote the entry, have spoken about the big Sahib Ram canvas, the wall hanging, and there's so many things that people are bringing to this from different angles, that just really enrich our understanding of this one work, which is a major work. It is for my money, it's the major masterpiece, but other people have their favorites, but it is, it takes a village, in this case a global village, I think, to kind of really get our heads around these things. So that's something that's really come across with this book.
Speaking of favourites, can I go back to Aparna and ask you, because actually you spoke about the Tati Ram, that you've contributed a number of pieces to this book, actually more than many others, and that's partly because you were sitting there as curator, and unlike most of us who can thought to approach the collection as a specialist, you were obliged to be a generalist. So now that you've stepped aside for a while, just looking back, looking back on the collection as a whole, what for you are the highlights, the favourite things that you will always remember as having been privileged to work with?
I'm going to make it a bit more difficult and ask you to pick one.
Oh dear. Almost impossible, isn't it? My heart will always be with Pratap Singh and that beautiful image of him in the garden where everything sort of comes together. There are musicians. Catherine, I think we showed you that one. There are musicians, there's a garden, there's a procession that maps time at the background. So everything about it is fascinating. And what I really enjoy is how the world seems to come into Jaipur. You've got Mughal influences, you've got Deccani influences, you've got European influences. Everything is right there. And that just makes the collection fascinating. And I'm going to be a bit contrary and say the paper cut. There's a collage in the gallery, which is just the most sublime. I had to fight to write on that one. And I think that it was because I was in Jaipur that I could get away with so many entries. And at some point, Giles and Mrinalini had to say, enough, no more, we can't have that many. But each object is fascinating. But those are my two picks, the Pratap Singh and the paper cut.
So Aparna's written on both of those things in the book on pages 98 and 120. Thank you very much.
I also wondered, given that, as Catherine mentioned, it takes a village to talk about an object, I wondered, picking up on that but going in the opposite direction, which of the other entries were your favorite? And if I asked each of you to pick one, and of course you're welcome to chip in the room as well. I mean, what was something that stood out to you, or that you thought, I mean, you loved something new? I don't know, you could have any reason. And I wondered if something immediately came to mind.
I love that paper cut. That was one of my top favorites. The paper cut. I already asked Giles, but perhaps I can ask Aparna. Are there lots more? Is that the best out of all the paper cuts, or can you talk more about other examples in the collection?
Can you hear the question, Aparna?
No, I can't. Can you repeat this, please?
Yeah, it's just is that the only paper cut in the collection? Are there others? Why did you pick that particular one? I think that it was the best example
What again? Sorry?
The paper cut.
Oh no, we have other Sanji images. We have other Sanji examples in the collection, but this one I think was one of the most fabulous. Mrin was involved, and I think Giles to pick it. But I think that we have several in the collection, but this was just the most beautiful. And my favorite thing about it is that it mixes real flowers and with imaginary ones, and then there are birds and things. So it's gorgeous. It's the most complex one I've seen in the collection as well.
So, Laura, Catherine, do you have examples that come to mind, or should I give you a couple of minutes while I ask another question to maybe think of something? 1 minute, okay.
I can.
Yeah.
Give it a go. I mean, one thing I just would say before picking favorites is that I think you've done a tremendous job of bringing together scholars and objects and selecting things. I was so excited and impressed by the fact that there are manuscripts of really intriguing, clearly important texts that are unillustrated, that are in there because they are objects of importance with textual meaning and also material meaning. And I just really applaud you for not going the obvious route and having things only with pretty pictures. And then I'm going to just take the easy way out and say that I think it was Mrin who wrote about another one of the wonderful Sawai Ram Singh photographs of women, where it's the woman who's kind of cross-dressing and standing in a very jaunty pose with a long sword. I just absolutely love that. Talk about fluidity and play and performance. It's all there in that one, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah, if I can just add my favorites of the ones that are not actually my research interest, I absolutely love the Gautakia, the embroidered cushions. They're absolutely exquisite. I would actually love to see high resolution JPEGs of these because the scenes are clearly so elaborate and so beautiful, and the idea that these are embroidered, it's just really sort of tickled my fancy. Bizarrely, my first interest in anything to do with India was through textiles back when I was very young, under 20, and so it's always drawn me in and always drawn my eyes. So one of the reasons I really enjoyed hearing more about the textiles today. And yes, it's definitely the cushion covers.
You have to see them in person. You can get high-res images, but
no, exactly. Yeah, you do have to. You have to.
I really envy Giles writing about the cenotaphs. I think we all just sort of forget how beautiful they are. All the chhatris, Maharani's chhatris, but especially the ones in Ghetto. So those are fantastic too.
What? Media who wrote about them. Okay.
Oh yes, Melia wrote about them, right?
So unless anyone else has something to add, I also just want, so obviously everyone in the room, but virtually and here in the room physically, but everyone's clearly quite passionate about the things that they work on, and we obviously think that Jaipur has brilliant collections, but how myopic are we being? I wonder. All of these sort of the cultural worlds of the Jaipur Court, surely this is not specific to Jaipur alone. So I just wondered, about the role that things like palace museums play, and access to collections and being able to write about them. The role that it plays in allowing us to construct these narratives of these places, which obviously have a knock-on effect in terms of visibility, prominence, etc., etc. I wondered if anybody had thoughts on that.
If I may add something, I think that there are other princely or ex-princely states that do have such collections, but which are just far less well known in the public domain. I'm thinking particularly of the Raza Library in Rampur, which has extraordinary things, but they're really very inaccessible and very unavailable for various reasons that go back a long way. And I've been fortunate to see some of the things in their collections, and they do have really, really good conservatives working with their materials now, but not so much digitizing. And I think, you know, this is really pioneering work that the museum is doing. And it's also, I think it's the tip of a very, very large iceberg.
Can I say something?
Peter had a comment, and then perhaps we can come back.
I just wanted to say it's a complete outside from all this. My answer to your question is yes, it is well worthwhile. It has been absolutely fascinating all day. I've been enormously impressed by the range, the difference. But the thing which has really come home to me is your original question some time ago. And it seems to me you answered it. You answered it by saying, every time I look at these things, I see something new. Hence, if it's all around the world and there's little people looking at it, they're constantly seeing something new. And Giles said, every time someone comes in, often when people come into the place, because we don't know everything, they illuminate it because they bring something else. There's your answer to having it all around the world. Now, I'm sure there are dozens of other things like that around the world. I mean, these things are effectively infinite. But to see the focus on something and to see that happening before our eyes, I have to say has been inspirational. And I'm sure there are lots of other places you could do it too with the energy. But goodness me, thank you for doing it for Jaipur.
Thank you. Very trouble. No, but I wanted to say, is having travelled to India for quite a few years and having gone through many institutions and looked at many exhibitions, that there are problems in the training of curators, in all of that. That's starting to change. That's really good. I think Jaipur is probably one of the ones that have changed. You know, I'm comparing it not to put down anybody. You know, it's tricky to say anything, but I think the training and also the archival processes whereby works of art are preserved. This is some of the problems in India are being resolved now. But, you know, I'm talking about temperature. I'm talking about what you put your textiles in, what you put your photographs in. Like, for example, Tasvir, my work with Tasvir was training him how to preserve photographs and what were archived, you know, how to handle photographs. And now with MAP, you know, this new Museum of Art and Photography, one of their remits is to train future curators. And it's an educational project. You know, and I guess everybody needs to be doing that in their way. And not all here, but in India, it's just a bit of a lag for some of those things, yeah.
I was wondering if I could reframe your question in a slightly different way. So rather than being about ways would be myopic and whether there are things in other similar palace museum collections, whether there's anything like the sort of national trust, country house moment that's happening in these palace collections. So, you know, there's been a real movement to tell LGBT stories in the country house, or the ways in which these collections and what's in them is imbricated with the slave trade and stories about violence. And hearing, you know, we've had presentations on swords and we've had presentations that touched upon sexuality, but I wonder what's missing and what kinds of histories are not being written about and not being told. And also whether we can maybe, I mean, I hate to say this, but lots of the work has celebrated the cosmopolitan. And I wonder if we could maybe think through other frames that maybe look at these collections as problematic. So rather than celebrating the cosmopolitan cultures and the various things that we can find in them and we can celebrate in them, what is perhaps slightly unsavory that we find in these collections?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I would love for our work to be able to address more of that. Giles, do you want to jump in on that at all? Yeah.
I think I would say we guarded. There are challenges in dealing with. But your question also implies something else about collaboration between different institutions. And yes, we've often thought that, I mean, we have close ties in Jaipur with Jodhpur, with the Maharaja Museum Trust. A number of us, like Robert and myself, have written for both trusts. And yes, we haven't yet made the next step, which is to have a proper collaboration in terms of the way in which we present ourselves and think through the kind of stories that we tell and share experiences of archiving and conservation.
Could I just ask, or just comment? It's just a reflection, really. It's not really a question. It's just a thought. Because I'm a historian of Sindh. Sindh is just across the border from Rajasthan in the sense the Tar Desert, or that region, you know, is on both. And you talked earlier, really, about conversations. And it feels like there is a bit of an elephant in the room in terms of conversations, which is how does one begin or encourage more of a conversation between the Indian side of this border and the Pakistan side of the border, and just how all the wonderful things that you've just described, even with the caveats of maybe a certain kind of history being kind of presented, cosmopolitan, etc. You just feel that this, you know, a region has been bisected, and I don't know enough about Jaipur to know, but I'm sure at times, you know, they looked in that direction as much as they looked towards Delhi, but, you know, Multan, as you were saying earlier, or up to Lahore. And it just feels that how does one encourage that conversation at a time when maybe conversations are not being encouraged or are being, I don't mean by people in this room, I mean more broadly. So that's just my thought. This is just.
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, for our part, I can't remember the name, but we did have somebody write to us from a library. I can't remember if it was in Sindh, but it was somewhere in Pakistan. And it was Bahawalpur, okay. And they wrote to us saying, you know, we've come across your publications, could you send them to us? And we did. That was our little tiny effort to try and make that connection. But you're absolutely right, and that's not an issue that plagues, you know, the Princely Palace Museum, etc. alone. Chandigarh, which is the Chandigarh Museum, which is what I've worked on elsewhere. I mean, this is a huge and a common problem. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I think digitization is one big step forward because, for example, the National Archives of India, you don't have to go to India to access them now. A lot of documents are digitized, continue to be digitized. I think that is one big step. I think there are fewer initiatives to connect museums across the border than there are to, for example, capture partition histories and more recent 20th century history. But that's just my understanding of the situation. And yeah, no, it's a really good question, but also something that I think is important and urgent, and I don't necessarily have the answer.
No, I don't.
But thank you for flagging it. No, thank you for flagging it, because as Jaipur also did, I mean, we do tend to get a little insular in our little palace museum world as well, despite wanting to collaborate with a Jaipur or whatever. That is still nevertheless, you know, a sphere of its own, and it's good to be pushed to break out of that. So thank you for flagging that. Renate.
Maybe just one comment, I'll focus kind of in an oblique way, touches also on Jackie's question. So to me, it's the specificity of the Palace Museum, which is a particular kind of museum, which we haven't talked about as well, which might have its opportunity and its limitations as well, and how that sits within a larger landscape of maybe national museum, you know, what its place is, and, you know, what that means in terms of what it allows and maybe what it isn't allows.
Any comments?
It's quite critical. I mean, when you start getting into the details of the different museums and some of their.
But also these things operate at different levels. So again, one of my images is this kind of the conception of the nation from the region. So a place like Jaipur versus a museum at Delhi, but also within that regional museum, you know, how can we break it down to address some of the questions that Jagdeep was asking? There's sorts of less savory aspects of history is one thing, but for example, if you look at it from a social justice lens, perhaps, you know, so yes, again, not an answer to your question, but a very valid comment. And I know that Jodhpur, for example, was, I don't know what the state of that project is, but I do remember that they had in recent years set up an oral history project wanting to precisely bring in elements of the fort's history, you know, by talking to people who've been working there for generations that were not, you know, kind of focused on the rulers of the elite. But equally, I remember at a museum conference, the then curator, director, who was sadly no longer with us, was asked a question about the founding of the fort and why it is that they don't mention that, and perhaps you might want to spell that one out, because it just illustrates the sorts of challenges that institutions like that do face in terms of the history and stories they tell.
Just remembering, as I said, that the former director tragically who died in the we're talking at a conference actually in GMU a few years ago. One of the problems of access, which you're referring to, is that in the Palace Museum, it's almost a directive to approach the collections from the perspective of royal patronage. And that's, as it were, the source and origin of everything. We tried rather to look a bit more from the perspective of the contributing artists to balance that a bit. But Pani Singh was put on the back foot by, as you would expect, an audience of GA students, by somebody who was a representative of the local tribal community who claimed that it was her community who had built Maharaja.
And she might to some level be right in the sense that the labour force, of course, was not Rajput that built it. We think Maharaja was a Rajput citadel that was actually constructed by the labour force. So that story was simply not told.
And of course, a lot of these forts have origin stories where somebody or the other is presented as a willing human sacrifice to ensure the stability and longevity of the fort and the dynasty. So these are all, they're presented as celebratory, but is it really? I mean, what we're looking at
that whole story around the handprints.
Those are the women. That's a whole other
There are similar stories about the relationship between the Rajputs and the Minas. The kingdom is founded upon the defeat of the Minas, who then suddenly become loyal, stalwart upholders of the state. How was that?
Thank you. That's good. Sorry.
It's wrap up. So thank you very much to our panel. I think we can consider masterpieces when truly launched. Thank you all for your questions and to the discussion this evening.
Thank you for coming. Thanks to Matty for the text.